It began in fire and frost in a small Belgian village buried in snow, surrounded by the endless silence of the Ardennes. It was December 1944, and the forests of Belgium had become the crucible of Hitler's last great gamble. The Battle of the Bulge raged across the region, a storm of steel and ice that caught the Allied armies by surprise and threatened, for a moment, to turn the tide of the entire war. At the heart of that storm lay a single village, La Gleize, a name few knew then, but one that would soon echo through history. Here, amid the snow-choked hills and frozen rivers, one of the most ferocious armored engagements of the Ardennes would unfold. This is the entire history of the Battle of La Gleize, a battle of courage and desperation, where German steel met American resolve, and where the dream of Hitler's last victory froze to death in the snow. The story of La Gleize began with Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's final counteroffensive in the West. In mid-December 1944, 3 German armies, including the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. Their objective was bold: smash through the thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the attack would split the Allied front in two, force the Western Allies into retreat, and perhaps even change the course of the war. It was in Hitler's mind a miracle waiting to happen. But miracles are fragile things, and in the Ardennes they froze and died under the weight of reality. At the tip of Dietrich's advance was Kampfgruppe Peiper, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, one of the most aggressive and feared tank leaders of the war. His column, over 5,000 men, 100 tanks, and a long trail of half-tracks and trucks, was the spearhead of the entire German offensive in the north. His orders were clear: drive west with lightning speed, seize bridges over the Meuse, and open the road to Antwerp. Speed was everything. Delay meant disaster, and for 3 days Peiper's men cut through the snow like a blade, ambushing convoys, capturing villages, and leaving behind trails of fire and blood. But the Ardennes was not kind to ambition. The narrow, twisting roads were choked with snow, ice, and wreckage. Allied engineers blew bridges faster than Peiper could cross them. Fuel ran low, resistance stiffened, and everywhere the Americans fought back with stubborn, quiet ferocity. At Stavelot, Peiper's tanks were delayed by the courageous stand of the 38th Infantry Regiment and the 9th Armored Division, who blew up the town's bridge under his nose. In frustration, Peiper's men lashed out, massacring civilians and prisoners, spreading terror through the villages they passed. The speed of his advance slowed, the clock of fate began to tick louder, and his route westward narrowed to one final road, the road to La Gleize. La Gleize, a small village perched on a hill above the Amblève River, was supposed to be just another waypoint. Instead, it became the trap. By December 17th, Peiper's column had reached Stermont, only a few miles away, but his tanks were now running on fumes. The American counterattack, led by the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division, and supported by Sherman tanks of the 7th Armored Division, was closing in from all sides. The skies, once grounded by fog, cleared just enough for Allied aircraft to strike. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, dropping bombs on the narrow roads, torching vehicles and scattering survivors. The German Spearhead, once unstoppable, was now being hunted. Peiper withdrew to La Gleize, where the stone houses and steep terrain offered strong defensive ground. There, in the bitter cold of December 21st, he made his stand. The village became a fortress. Every house a bunker, every window a gun port. His men, Waffen-SS veterans from the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, set up machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns, digging into the snow and rubble. They were surrounded by silence and snow, but the enemy was closing in. From the west came American infantry and armor, creeping through the trees. From the south, artillery began to pound the village with relentless precision. The once proud column of panzers had become a pocket of resistance, trapped, frozen, and doomed. For 3 days, La Gleize burned. The Americans attacked in waves, pushing into the village through smoke and snow. Sherman tanks clashed with King Tigers, their shells tearing through the narrow streets. The roar of engines echoed through the valley, mingled with the screams of wounded men and the crack of rifles. Peiper's troops fought with grim defiance, refusing to surrender even as their ammunition dwindled and their wounded froze where they lay. Each house was fought for, room by room, in brutal close-quarters combat. The snow turned black with soot and red with blood. By December 23rd, Peiper's position was hopeless. His tanks were out of fuel, his men out of supplies, and the ring around La Gleize had closed tight. American artillery pounded the village day and night, collapsing buildings and setting fires that lit the snow in flickering orange. Still, Peiper refused to surrender. That night, under cover of darkness and snow, he made his choice. Abandoning his vehicles, including his last King Tiger tanks, now silent and empty, he led his remaining 800 men on foot, slipping through the forests and ravines toward the German lines. The march was brutal, freezing cold, no food, no rest, but somehow a fraction of his force made it back. The rest were captured, wounded, or dead. When dawn came, La Gleize was silent again. The snow covered the bodies, the tanks, the ruins. The spearhead of the German offensive had been cut off and destroyed. The Battle of La Gleize marked the end of Peiper's advance and the beginning of the end for the Battle of the Bulge. His failure to break through sealed the fate of the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, forcing it onto the defensive. The dream of reaching Antwerp was gone forever. Hitler's winter gamble, his final act of defiance in the West, had broken against the courage of soldiers who refused to yield. The American lines had bent, but they had not broken, and in that resilience lay the final doom of the Reich. The cost of La Gleize was immense. The village was almost completely destroyed. Its people, caught between fire and snow, lost their homes and their history. More than 100 German tanks and vehicles were left behind, their wrecks littering the roads and fields for decades after. Among them was Tiger 213, one of the massive King Tiger tanks abandoned during Peiper's escape, a silent monument to the hubris and collapse of the Waffen-SS. Today, that same tank still stands in La Gleize, preserved as a reminder of what war leaves behind. The story of La Gleize is the story of defiance, of men trapped by fate, fighting not for victory, but for survival, of civilians who endured unspeakable suffering, and of soldiers who stood their ground in the darkest winter of the war. It is a story of ambition undone by endurance, of arrogance humbled by weather, courage, and time. Today, La Gleize is quiet once more, its houses rebuilt, its church bells ringing where once shells exploded. The forests that hid tanks now whisper with the wind, but beneath the soil, beneath the roots of trees, lie the remnants of that frozen battle. Spent shells, rusted helmets, and memories that will never fade. The village that once marked the high tide of Hitler's last offensive now stands as the monument to its failure. The Battle of La Gleize was more than a clash of armor and fire. It was the moment the Bulge began to crumble, the turning of the tide in a war's final winter. It was where the last great German thrust met the immovable strength of those who refused to break. Tonight we return to that snow-covered village, to the crackle of frozen gunfire, the echo of tank engines in the mist, and the silent dawn that followed the storm. This is the entire history of the Battle of La Gleize, the fight that ended the spearhead of the Bulge, the battle that broke the last illusion of victory, and the moment where courage outlasted ambition. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you listening somewhere warm, far from the snow and thunder of the Ardennes? Or can you almost feel the chill of that frozen wind whispering through the ruins of La Gleize? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 hours, near the village of Billingen, Belgium. The air was thick with fog so dense it seemed to swallow sound. For Allied intelligence officers stationed at Spa, it was just another bitter winter morning in the quiet Ardennes sector, a so-called rest front. The situation reports filed the previous night by the G2 section of the 12th Army Group indicated no significant enemy buildup. In London, the British War Office summarized German capabilities as limited to defensive operations due to fuel shortages and manpower exhaustion. Only faint echoes of artillery drifting through the mist suggested otherwise. To Belgian farmers tending frostbitten livestock near Stavelot, those distant rumbles felt too heavy, too deliberate. Within hours, that fog would become the curtain for Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The Allied assumption rested on terrain analysis that was, on paper, sound. The Ardennes was described in the December 8th SHF briefing document Operations Estimate 247B as unsuitable for armoured thrusts due to narrow roads, poor visibility, and restricted manoeuvre corridors. American engineers had measured road gradients exceeding 12% in several key areas and bridges unable to support vehicles over 30 tons. To analysts, that eliminated any possibility of a large-scale tank offensive. Yet German planners of Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein saw the same data as opportunity, not obstacle. They had mapped every forest track and calculated convoy spacing down to the meter. Their conclusion, what the Allies saw as impossible terrain, was perfect cover for surprise. Inside the intelligence bunker at Spa, Captain Harold D. McNeil of the U.S. First Army's G2 section reviewed radio intercepts from the previous 48 hours. The decrypt team at Bletchley Park had flagged several Luftwaffe weather reports mentioning Operation Steyr, but these were dismissed as deception chatter. McNeil compared these to traffic analysis showing sudden silence from several panzer divisions east of the Rhine, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Silence, he noted in his report, was not inherently alarming. In hindsight, it was the most alarming detail of all. The German radio blackout masked the concentration of 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks along a 70-mile front. At the same hour, Belgian civilians in the hamlet of Troy-Ponce noticed the ground trembling as if from a distant train. In fact, those vibrations came from heavy vehicles, Tiger II tanks weighing nearly 70 tons each, crawling forward under orders from SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. Villagers like Jean-Paul Thibault later recalled hearing the earth growl before the engines could be seen. The fog and snow that morning limited visibility to less than 100 meters, grounding Allied reconnaissance aircraft entirely. The US 9th Air Force logged 0 sorties due to meteorological obstruction, sealing the blindness from above. Nature itself was part of Germany's battle plan. Weather data collected from the Allied Meteorological Section at Verdun recorded barometric pressure of 994 millibars, unusually low, and dense cloud cover up to 2,000 feet. For the Germans, this was divine timing. The Luftwaffe's meteorological unit, Wetterdienstgruppe West, had forecast this exact window 3 weeks prior and relayed it to OKW headquarters in Ziegenberg. The offensive would begin precisely when Allied air superiority, their most decisive advantage, would be neutralized. British Group Captain James Stagg, who had guided the D-Day forecast 6 months earlier, noted in his post-war memoir that the same weather that saved the invasion now doomed our reconnaissance. Back at SHAF headquarters in Versailles, Major General Kenneth Strong, Chief of Intelligence, reviewed the December 15th situation summary at 8 o'clock. His team reported enemy activity along the Ardennes front remains minimal. The assumption was that German reserves were committed to the Eastern Front or in refit near Cologne. The report cited captured field messages referring to shortages of petrol and ammunition. None of these accounts, however, considered that the Wehrmacht had been hoarding over 4 million gallons of fuel in hidden dumps near Encirclement. Strong initialed the summary, unaware that within 24 hours, Kampfgruppe Peiper would be spearheading the 6th Panzer Army's breakthrough. By midday, Belgian radio operators in Malmedy intercepted garbled transmissions from east of the Aar River. A few used the phrase Drakenmarsch, meaning Dragon's March, an old code word for rapid mechanized movement. Yet the signals were disregarded by Allied monitoring stations overwhelmed by traffic from the ongoing operations in the Hurtgen forest. Lieutenant Henry Carver, of the Signal Corps, later testified that the circuits were full and we had no context for what we heard. Those missed fragments, meaningless at the time, were the first hints of Peiper's armoured column moving west. The Allies had eyes everywhere, but they were all looking in the wrong direction. As evening descended over the Ardennes, fog thickened into a white wall across the hills. In Stavelot, civilians packed what they could carry, blankets, bread, family photographs, and began walking toward Spa. They didn't know what was coming, only that the earth itself seemed restless. Inside Allied command posts, teletypes clicked calmly, unaware they were about to record chaos. The fog that morning had hidden more than geography. It had concealed the beginning of Germany's final bid to turn the Western Front upside down. The question now was simple, chilling, and unanswered. What was moving behind that curtain of mist? December 14th, 1944, 22:15 hours, Münstereifel, Germany. In a dimly lit command room beneath the flicker of carbide lamps, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stood over a map spread across a scarred oak table. Around him, staff officers from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment and the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment traced thin pencil lines westward through Losheim, Stavelot, Troyes Ponts, and finally the Meuse River at He. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, leaned over Peiper's shoulder and spoke quietly, "The Führer expects you to be first across." The order was both a privilege and a burden. Peiper's task was simple in wording, impossible in execution: to punch a hole through the American front, seize the Meuse bridges intact, and open the road to Antwerp. Outside, in the snow-choked motor pools, mechanics worked through the night to prepare the machines that would carry that ambition west. Under torchlight, the silhouettes of Tiger II heavy tanks loomed like metallic beasts awaiting release. Each Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Oz B weighed nearly 70 tons, powered by the Maybach HL 230 P30 engine, delivering 700 horsepower. The mechanics of SS Panzer Regiment 1 checked road wheels, tightened track tension to 75 mm, and refilled the twin Bosch headlamps with acetylene gas. Of Peiper's 117 armoured vehicles, 18 were these Tiger Ols, formidable in armour and gun, but dangerously slow on narrow Ardennes roads. Their main weapon, the 8.8 cm K 43L71, could pierce 160 mm of armour at 2 kilometers. Yet each mile travelled consumed over 5 gallons of fuel. The logistics officers calculated that even under ideal conditions, fuel shortages could halt the advance within 48 hours. The numbers already foretold the battle's hidden enemy time. The concept of a Kampfgruppe, literally battle group, was the distillation of German tactical adaptability, formed from mixed elements of armour, infantry, and engineers. It functioned as a modular strike unit able to maneuver independently. Peiper's group combined SS Panzer Regiment 1, the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, elements of the 3rd SS Panzer Jäger Battalion, and Flak-Abteilung 501 for anti-air defense. This combined arms approach mirrored the flexibility once championed by Heinz Guderian during the Blitzkrieg years. By contrast, General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army organized its attack on the principle of phased methodical advances, cautious, synchronized, and designed to preserve strength. Peiper's design was the opposite, to move so fast that the front collapsed before resistance could organize. It was less a spear, more a bullet fired through fog. Before dawn on December 15th, Peiper's adjutant, SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Sternebeck, distributed Befehlsblatt 21B, the operational order detailing their route and objectives. The document outlined exact phase lines: Phase 1, capture of Honsfeld; Phase 2, seizure of Stavelot; Phase 3, reach the Meuse within 48 hours. The order stressed Schnelligkeit und Härte, speed and ruthlessness. Peiper knew his reputation preceded him. At Kharkov in 1943, his battle group had counterattacked Soviet armor and retaken the city center in less than 24 hours, earning him the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. That same aggressiveness now defined his mission in the Ardennes. But where the Russian plains offered space and mobility, the snow-choked valleys of Belgium offered only constriction and chaos. What worked in the east might now destroy him in the west. In the workshops, engineers inspected the Panthers, 57 of them, each equipped with the 7.5 cm KK-42 L-70 gun and powered by a 700 horsepower Maybach engine. Their frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees, offered the same protection as 80 mm of flat steel. Yet their torsion bar suspension was already stiff from the cold. Crews greased every hinge and wrapped muzzle brakes in cloth to prevent ice formation. Meanwhile, drivers studied road maps annotated with bridge load limits. Most crossings in the Amblev Valley could not handle vehicles over 35 tons. Peiper's heavy Tigers would have to rely on wooden trestles hastily reinforced by the SS Pioneer Battalion 1. Every kilometer west meant another engineering puzzle, another delay. Each hour lost bled away the one thing the Germans could never replace: momentum. While Peiper's tanks readied, Hitler's headquarters at the Adlerhorst issued Directive Number 11 for Wacht am Rhein. All units to advance without delay once the artillery preparation ceases. Surprise and shock are the decisive weapons. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed it at 3 o'clock hours, his pen trembling slightly in the cold. The directive emphasized the psychological element that the sudden reappearance of SS armor in the West would paralyze Allied command decisions. It was a gamble dependent on speed, secrecy, and synchronized assault. American doctrine, by comparison, emphasized defense in depth, successive lines designed to absorb and delay breakthroughs. The German plan sought to render such lines irrelevant by collapsing them before they existed. On paper, the logic was immaculate. On the ground, it was perilously fragile. That night, Peiper sat in his field office, a requisitioned farmhouse outside Münsterreifel, studying his operational map by candlelight. He traced his route with a gloved finger, murmuring the place names under his breath. Honsfeld, Bühlingen, Neuville, Stavelot. Each was a stepping stone toward the Meuse. His staff recalled that he spoke little, only reminding them, no retreat, no delay. Outside, the mechanics loaded ammunition, 88mm shells for the Tigers, 75mm for the Panthers, and 20mm flak rounds. The smell of oil, fuel, and frost mixed in the air. Peiper understood the stakes. This was not just another battle, but the last chance to reverse the war's direction. Every decision from this night forward would echo through ruin or redemption. By dawn on December 16th, the Spearhead was ready. 4,800 men, 117 tanks, and over 300 half-tracks. Engines coughed to life, exhaust plumes cutting through the darkness like torchlight. Radio operators tuned to frequency 42.3 megacycles, the net call sign Comet. Peiper climbed into his command, Panther, its armor already frosted white. Behind him, the column stretched for nearly 4 kilometers, steel, fuel, and ambition bound for the unknown. The men of the Leibstandarte called themselves Hitler's Fire Brigade, and they were about to prove why. Ahead lay the snow-covered ridges of the Ardennes, and beyond them, the Meuse. Whether they reached it or not would decide the fate of the entire offensive. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 hours, Losheim Gap, Belgium. The men of the 99th Infantry Division's 393rd Regiment were still stirring from their foxholes when the darkness erupted with over 1,600 German guns. The ground convulsed as shells from 105mm howitzers and 150mm Nebelwerfer rockets tore into the ridgeline. Private Richard Cowan later recalled that the snow turned black, then orange, then black again. The barrage was so dense that the U.S. Army's own counter-battery radar units briefly malfunctioned under the shockwaves. In less than 15 minutes, every forward telephone line to battalion command was severed. When the shelling lifted, machine gun bursts crackled from the tree line. The opening act of Hitler's last gamble had begun. To the men in those trenches, it felt less like a battle and more like the earth itself was being unmade. Behind that storm of fire, Peiper's Kampfgruppe pushed forward from Lanzereth toward the Losheim Gap, a narrow corridor less than 2 kilometers wide that formed the natural gateway into Belgium. The 1st SS Panzer Regiment's lead element consisted of Panthers and half-tracks advancing in staggered columns. Field reports from Obersturmführer Werner Sternebeck recorded average progress at only 5 kilometers per hour due to road congestion and dense fog limiting visibility to 50 meters. The artillery preparation had been textbook blitzkrieg, brief, overwhelming, and synchronized, yet the terrain was its opposite. The single-lane forest road, bordered by snowbanks and thick pine, became a choke point where every vehicle was forced into single file. When one half-track slipped off the embankment near AUW, the entire column halted for 30 minutes. Each pause cost not just fuel, but momentum, the true lifeblood of Peiper's timetable. At the receiving end of that advance stood the thinly stretched lines of the US 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions. General Walter Lauer's command post at Elsenborn received garbled radio traffic from forward companies describing tanks in the woods and enemy in strength, but communication lag turned minutes into fatal hours. American defenses were based on the assumption of limited German capability, a belief still reinforced by Schaff's intelligence summary dated December 15th. Unlike the mobile Panzer Grenadiers, the American rifle companies were static, relying on pre-sighted artillery and M4 Sherman support that never arrived. When one platoon of Shermans from Company B, 741st Tank Battalion, attempted to counterattack near Manderfeld, they bogged down in snowdrifts more than half a meter deep. German panzers struck first, and their long-barreled 75mm shells turned the valley into a furnace. For Peiper's men, the success was immediate but not seamless. Reports from SS Hauptsturmführer Gustav Knittel of the 1st SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion noted that artillery coordination was breaking down as units lost radio contact. The standard German frequency of 42.3 megacycles was overcrowded, forcing subunits to switch to backup channels without confirmation. Forward observers could no longer direct fire precisely, causing several friendly barrages to fall short. In one instance, near Buchholz station, a misplaced Nebelwerfer strike hit Peiper's own infantry support column, destroying 2 half-tracks and killing 12 men. The chaos highlighted the weakness of the entire offensive: speed without cohesion. Every minute saved by advancing fast was undone by confusion born of poor communication and terrain unsuited for armored warfare. The Americans at the front lines were experiencing that confusion multiplied tenfold. Lieutenant Robert K. Scott of the 393rd Infantry Regiment described hearing engines shouting in German and nothing else. Without air reconnaissance, the 99th Division could not tell how large the attack was. The division artillery, operating M2A1 105mm howitzers, fired blind based on sound alone. Ammunition reports from Battery B logged an expenditure of over 1,000 rounds in 6 hours, yet few found actual targets. Peiper's panzers, meanwhile, bypassed strongpoints, leaving isolated American units surrounded in snow and fog. In one sector, 35 men of Company K surrendered when their ammunition froze solid in the breaches. By the time word reached division headquarters, entire platoons had vanished without a trace. By nightfall, on December 16th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had forced a breach through the Losheim Gap, but paid for it in lost time. The lead elements of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment advanced only 12 kilometers in 16 hours, half the planned rate. Traffic jams stretched back to the German border, where the 6th Panzer Army's supply convoys waited helplessly. Each Tiger Terror consumed nearly 700 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers, and Peiper's supply echelon had not yet caught up. American forces had been broken open, but the road west was clogged with their conqueror's own machines. The German High Command's report at 23 o'clock, Lagerbricht West, noted excellent tactical results, limited operational progress. Momentum once lost could not be regained easily in the Ardennes frozen arteries. Amid the wreckage of the American lines, the first atrocities of the offensive began. Near the village of Honsfeld, Peiper's vanguard captured a group of 19 men from the 99th Infantry Division. According to post-war testimony from survivors and German war diaries, the prisoners were executed beside the road. The killings were not yet the infamous massacre at Bolgnez, but they revealed the brutality woven into the Spearhead's doctrine: no delay, no prisoners. For the American troops still holding the forest edges, this changed everything. What had begun as a battle for ground became a struggle for survival. Fear turned defensive lines into desperate retreats, and by dawn Peiper's panzers rolled through the abandoned foxholes of men who had simply vanished into the snow. By the morning of December 17th, the Losheim sector had fallen silent except for the low rumble of engines heading west. Kampfgruppe Peiper had achieved what German planners intended, a rupture in the American front, but at the cost of time, coordination, and fuel. The 99th Division had been shattered but not destroyed. Its survivors regrouped along the Elsenborn Ridge, forming a new defensive line that would soon halt the SS advance. Peiper's column pressed onward, its route narrowing with every kilometre, its tanks burning more fuel than they could replace. What began as a lightning strike was already grinding into a logistical nightmare. The question now was not whether Peiper could break through, but whether he could keep moving at all. December 17th, 1944, 7:15 hours, Stavelot, Belgium. Peiper's Kampfgruppe rolled into the village streets, engines roaring over cobblestones still wet from melting snow. In the centre, a modest fuel depot containing approximately 50,000 gallons of 80-octane gasoline stood unguarded, its concrete bunkers abandoned in the chaos of American retreat. SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Poetschke's logistics team immediately organized siphoning operations, loading Panther and Tiger II fuel tanks directly from drums and tanker trucks. Outside, U.S. engineers of the 9th Engineer Battalion abandoned their charts and maps, fleeing as the armored column overtook their positions. Smoke from burning trucks clung low to the streets, creating a blinding, acrid fog. Each barrel seized represented minutes, hours, perhaps days of operational survival for the Spearhead. Peiper's men knew that without this cash, the advance would stall. The logistical reality was stark. Tiger IS consumed 700 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres on roads of optimal condition. Panthers required 500 litres per 100 kilometres, and Panzer IVs an additional 400 litres for the same distance. Every kilometre in snow, mud, or uphill terrain increased consumption by 20%. Poetschke's report of December 17th noted that delays at Losheim Gap had already burned through 32,000 litres of fuel, leaving the Spearhead dependent entirely on captured supplies. Allied air activity compounded the issue. Though fog grounded the Luftwaffe, sporadic sorties from the US 9th Air Force destroyed trucks in the supply echelons, stranding ammunition and fuel in mud-choked roads. Without the Stavelot cache, Peiper's timetable, meticulously calculated in the December 14th operational order, would collapse. The contrast between German scarcity and Allied abundance was striking. American logistical doctrine relied on forward dumps, continuous resupply, and mechanized trucks capable of carrying 5,000 litres of fuel per convoy. Engineers could rapidly repair damaged bridges and clear snow-obstructed roads. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, had no organic supply fleet for winter operations in Belgium. Each tank in Peiper's Spearhead was effectively a missile on borrowed energy. The captured 50,000 gallons at Stavelot would fuel approximately 40 Tiger IS for only 70 kilometers of movement before depletion. This dependency created a brittle chain. Any disruption, a destroyed bridge, a misfired shell, or traffic congestion could immobilize the entire column. Field evidence quickly illustrated the consequences of this fragile supply line. Near Tros-Ponce, 1 Tiger II, chassis number 2, 80092, ran dry mid-road. Crew members attempted to roll it onto the embankment, but at 69 tons the tank was immovable by hand. Engineers recorded that even the Panther flank support vehicles were down by 50% fuel levels, forcing Peiper to divert precious reserves from operational use. The column slowed to an average of 3 km per hour through constricted, snow-laden roads, creating traffic jams extending nearly 3 km back towards Stoumont. Each delay threatened to unravel the momentum that was the sole advantage of the offensive. Despite repeated warnings from Bulge, Peiper refused to pause. Command radio at 12:30 hours carried terse messages. Advance regardless of fuel. Time is the weapon. The strategy relied on speed to overwhelm Allied positions before they could organize countermeasures. Yet the Ardennes terrain, narrow winding forest roads interspersed with partially frozen rivers and mud-choked culverts, amplified every logistical weakness. Where the Germans expected smooth, rapid progression, they encountered bottlenecks that converted each captured fuel gallon into a lifeline, not a guarantee. In effect, the Spearhead was consuming its own future to maintain present movement. Additional reports highlighted inefficiencies in fuel distribution. Half-tracks assigned as refuelers were frequently delayed or disabled, and barrels were siphoned inefficiently under battlefield stress, spilling roughly 15% of captured gasoline. Bulge documented a total wastage of nearly 7,000 litres within the first 2 hours of the Stavelot operation. The logistical breakdown contrasted sharply with Allied doctrine, where even temporary setbacks rarely halted resupply due to redundant vehicle networks and pre-positioned stockpiles. For Peiper, each wasted litre represented hundreds of meters of lost advance. By late afternoon, the operation faced the cruel arithmetic of fuel scarcity against territorial ambition. The human cost of this dependence was immediate and tangible. Crews abandoned vehicles in convoys, leaving half-tracks, jeeps, and even a Tiger II on the roadside. Soldiers trudged through snow to push or repair machines, their exhaustion compounded by sub-zero temperatures and the constant threat of American artillery. Morale was fragile. Men who had just crossed the Losheim Gap were now witnessing the tangible limits of their own hardware. Retreating American engineers, meanwhile, observed the abandoned tanks and noted in field diaries the ominous irony: the invaders' strength was as vulnerable as the ground beneath them. The capture of fuel allowed forward motion, but the gaps left behind foreshadowed a halt that could transform victory into stagnation. By nightfall on December 17th, Peiper's advance had consumed nearly all of the Stavelot depot's 50,000 gallons, leaving less than 10% reserve for the coming push toward Troches-Ponts and Stoumont. The road ahead was littered with abandoned vehicles, half-spent shells, and exhausted men, the spectacle of mechanical might now revealing its fragility. Supply delays, traffic congestion, and weather-induced consumption foreshadowed an operational ceiling that no captured fuel could circumvent. The Spearhead's momentum, the defining advantage of German strategy, was under existential threat. In the Ardennes, speed had been a weapon, but scarcity was already shaping the battle's fate. December 17th, 1944, 10:15 hours. Ardennes Crossroads, Belgium. A convoy of 84 U.S. soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, dismounted from M8 Greyhound armored cars and jeeps, crested the snowy rise when the first Panther rolled silently through the mist. SS Hauptsturmführer Joachim Peiper's lead tanks, including Tiger II chassis numbers 280112 and 280091, cut off the road ahead, effectively sealing the Americans in a killing zone barely 100 meters wide. PVT. Kenneth V. Brown later described the moment. "We could see the snow turn red before we even realized what was happening." Radio chatter between the 99th and 106th Divisions conveyed panic, with battalion command reporting contact with enemy, extreme casualties likely imminent. In minutes, the American formation was encircled, their vehicles rendered immobile by the frozen ground and German shells that shredded tires and tracks. The technical realities of the ambush made resistance nearly impossible. German forces had emplaced 3 overlapping machine gun sectors, each covering the icy road, with MG-42 SOV firing at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. Panther 75mm K-42 guns targeted observation vehicles, first neutralizing artillery spotters capable of calling for counter-battery fire. The Americans had no comparable forward-firing armor capable of long-range penetration. M8 Greyhounds were armed with 75mm howitzers firing low-velocity shells, effective only at short distances and thinly armored. As documented in After Action Report 01694, the engagement lasted less than 20 minutes, with the German column achieving near total control of the crossroads without sustaining a single tank kill. Comparing the tactical philosophies exposed stark contrasts. US doctrine emphasized dispersed formations, mobility over concentrated fire, and defensive fallback options. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, combined shock armor, machine gun enfilades, and integrated infantry with strict adherence to rapid-fire planning. On the Eastern Front, SS Panzer units had achieved similar rapid encirclements at Kharkov in 1943, yet those battles were fought against entrenched, less mechanized Soviet forces. Here the Americans were mechanized but underprepared, creating a lethal intersection where German planning and discipline intersected with opportunity. The technical superiority of long-barreled German 75mm guns versus the Americans' short-barreled, low-velocity weapons proved decisive. Field evidence underscores the human cost. Witness accounts from surviving 43 GIs, including PVT, Brown, and VAC. James H. Foster described being corralled into a snowfield where German tanks and infantry established a perimeter. Eyewitnesses noted precise German small unit positioning, blocking potential escape routes, while officers shouted commands in SS-specific radio codes. 84 men were executed within minutes by small arms fire and sidearm shots, leaving only 43 to flee under the cover of smoke and terrain. Post-war examinations, including the U.S. Army Historical Division Report, H-349, catalogued the sequence, noting that bodies remained for days under snow, a grim testament to the sudden collapse of battlefield law and order. The atrocity shattered more than the immediate convoy. It fractured the myth of German discipline and the aura of invincibility surrounding Peiper's Spearhead. Field reports from 6th Panzer Army Command showed radio traffic tension, as officers debated whether orders had been issued by Peiper himself or by subordinate SS elements. The psychological effect on nearby American units was profound. Fear replaced standard operational calculation. Units like the 2nd Battalion, 393rd Infantry Regiment, positioned just 3 kilometers away at Ligneville, immediately began reconfiguring defensive lines, anticipating similar encirclement tactics. Strategic intent collided with moral collapse, producing consequences that extended beyond the frozen fields of Ardennes. Additional evidence emerged from Nuremberg testimony. Survivors recounted not only the methodical executions, but also the atmosphere of tension among Peiper's own officers, some of whom protested to maintain discipline. SS Hauptsturmführer Gustav Knittel reported in his December 18th diary that the men were obeying orders but troubled in conscience, highlighting the friction between operational efficiency and moral restraint. Compared to the Eastern Front, where atrocities were systematized, here the executions were reactive, chaotic, and morally dissonant. The incident exemplified how operational success could devolve into war crimes, undermining both legality and strategy. The human and operational consequences were immediate. Escaped American soldiers spread word of the massacre, altering the tactical posture of the 99th Infantry Division and neighboring units. Allied artillery prepared to deliver fire missions not only against advancing armor, but also to prevent any further movement along the Ardennes corridor. Morale among SS troops, while outwardly disciplined, began showing signs of strain. Witness accounts noted men staring at the frozen bodies, questioning orders, and hesitating briefly at intersections previously traversed without pause. The execution undermined cohesion and foreshadowed later operational slowdowns at Stavelot and Ponts. By evening, the Ardennes crossroads stood empty, save for frozen snow, scattered debris, and the echo of 84 fallen soldiers. Peiper's advance continued west, but the moral collapse at Malmedy had shifted the narrative of the Ardennes. The SS Spearhead remained a tactical threat, yet the cost of the atrocity, human, psychological, and historical, was now inseparable from operational achievement. The question of whether Peiper had directly ordered the killings remained unresolved, even as surviving soldiers prepared to confront his advance at La Gleize. Momentum had not been lost, but the battlefield had changed in character. Speed and surprise were now shadowed by fear, scrutiny, and the long-term consequences of irreversible violence. December 18th, 1944, 08:30 hours. La Gleize, Belgium. A column of 60 operational tanks from SS Panzer Regiment 1, including Panther chassis numbers 702123 and 703119, rumbled into the snow-covered streets, their tracks grinding against icy cobblestones as artillery fire echoed from the ridgelines north of the village. Civilians, including Marcel Dubois and his family, fled into stone cellars, listening as shells splintered shutters and shook the church, which had been repurposed into Peiper's forward command post. Snow fell in fine flakes, dampening the sound but not the fear, and the US 30th Infantry Division prepared defensive positions at elevations of 385 meters, using the ridgelines for tactical advantage. Jeeps of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion moved into concealed positions, while Peiper's remaining force accounted for 60 tanks of mixed types, 22 Tigers, 20 Panthers, and 18 Panzer IVs. Every movement was timed, calculated, and radios buzzed with updates as Peiper coordinated the small fortress town's defense while maintaining forward momentum. Technical observations highlight the challenges facing the Germans. Panther tanks, each weighing 44 tons with a 75mm KST-42 L-Series 70 main gun, could engage targets effectively beyond 2 kilometers, yet their fuel consumption of 700 liters per 100 kilometers imposed severe operational limits. Tiger SEs, chassis numbers 280112 and 280091, demanded 1,000 liters per 100 kilometers and required flat terrain to avoid mechanical strain on the Maybach HL 230 engines. The narrow streets of La Gleize restricted maneuver, reducing firing arcs and limiting simultaneous target engagement, forcing Peiper's crews to stagger tank movements and rely on coordinated infantry cover. Captured reports from SS Hauptsturmführer Poetschke emphasized the critical balance between tactical dominance and mechanical preservation, noting that even one disabled Tiger II could compromise the line. Comparing opposing systems, US forces employed anti-tank tactics centered on terrain advantage, using M36 Jackson tank destroyers armed with 90mm guns and 100-meter engagement ranges, benefiting from hull-down positioning on ridgelines. German doctrine emphasized massed armor breakthroughs, speed, and combined arms coordination, with panzer grenadiers dismounting to secure flanks. The Ardennes' restrictive topography neutralized some German advantages, forcing the SS to adopt more static defensive positions within La Gleize, resembling urban combat scenarios previously seen at Stalingrad, albeit on a much smaller scale. The contrast exposed logistical and tactical vulnerabilities. The Americans could observe approaches from elevated positions, while German vehicles risked becoming isolated targets along narrow streets. Field evidence confirmed the precarious balance. Artillery observers reported that every German movement along Rue de la Chapelle could be seen from ridgeline foxholes established 200 meters north, creating predictable firing lanes. Sniper teams from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion incapacitated the lead Panther in less than 15 minutes, chassis 703119, immobilized by a single high-velocity round to its front glacis. Peiper's communications log shows 37 radio interruptions between 8:30 and 10:45 hours, illustrating the strain of coordinating urban defense while under intermittent artillery bombardment. The tactical effect forced the SS to disperse infantry and tanks, slowing westward progress and allowing American engineers to strengthen hasty roadblocks and minefields. The broader implications became evident as daylight waned. La Gleize's elevation and compact street grid made it defensible but exposed to concentrated artillery and air interdiction once clouds cleared. The German Spearhead's progress had transformed from rapid advance to measured occupation, dependent entirely on maintaining cohesion and conserving fuel. Intelligence reports transmitted to 6th Panzer Army indicated that supply shortages could halt further movement beyond Stoumont, making La Gleize both a fortress and potential tomb. Every strategic decision now carried the risk of operational immobilization, highlighting how terrain, logistics, and American firepower converged to constrain Peiper's options. Supporting evidence from post-war interviews and Peiper's war diary reveals conflicting perspectives among the SS leadership. Some officers, including SS Hauptsturmführer Knittel, suggested consolidating forces for a defensive line rather than continuing westward, citing only 60 operable tanks and diminishing fuel reserves. Civilians like Marcel Dubois, hiding beneath church pews, documented artillery impacts and tank maneuvers in handwritten journals, providing historians with exact times and shell counts, later cited in the U.S. Army Historical Division document H-403. Comparison with Eastern Front urban operations shows that while German combined arms integration was sound, the Ardennes offered no room for the maneuver depth previously exploited at Kharkov or Kiev. The human and operational consequences became increasingly tangible. Civilians endured shelling and close-quarters encounters, with families rationing food and water in cellars for 48 hours straight. Peiper's crews faced mounting psychological stress, aware that every tank disabled or destroyed further limited their chances of reaching the Meuse River. Radio messages indicated minor mutinous murmurs among some Panzer Grenadier units, reluctant to push into densely mined zones without armor support. American artillery and infantry positioned on surrounding ridges executed precise counter-fire missions, further complicating German command and creating a persistent sense of vulnerability within La Gleize. By dusk on December 19th, La Gleize had become emblematic of the broader Ardennes campaign, a temporary German stronghold under siege, poised on the knife edge between continued advance and complete encirclement. The village's elevation, combined with terrain-limited streets and fuel-dependent armor, constrained Peiper's tactical options, forcing a defensive mindset contrary to his previous blitzkrieg doctrine. Civilians remained hidden, artillery continued to land nearby, and the Americans prepared for the inevitable counterattack. The stakes were clear. Peiper could not sustain occupation without fuel or reinforcements, and every delay increased the probability of encirclement, setting the stage for the dramatic clashes and eventual destruction of his spearhead. December 20th, 1944, 7:45 hours, La Gleize, Belgium, US 30th Infantry Division. Artillery observers adjusted fire from positions along ridges at Troy Ponce and Stowmont, their M1 155mm howitzers, zeroing on Peiper's command post inside the snow-laden church. German tankers, including Panther chassis 702123 and Tiger II 280112, rumbled cautiously through cobbled streets under intermittent shellfire, while medics from the 1st SS Panzer attempted triage in crypts below. Civilians like Marcel Dubois and his family scrambled through narrow alleyways, carrying blankets over frozen snow to avoid exposure. Radio chatter between Peiper and his officers indicated fuel reserves had dropped below 5,000 litres, forcing rationing that threatened the operation's continuation. Deep blizzards reduced visibility to fewer than 50 meters, grounding Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes and leaving German positions vulnerable to concentrated American fire. Tactical maps indicated that 300 artillery pieces per mile of front had encircled the village, transforming La Gleize from a forward base into a potential trap. Technical assessment of the situation revealed the severe logistical limitations facing Peiper, Tiger II heavy tanks, each weighing 70 tons with a frontal armor thickness of 150 mm, required at least 300 liters per hour of idling in extreme cold to prevent engine seizure. Panthers, with 44 tons of weight and 75 mm guns, demanded constant lubrication of their final drives, which froze rapidly in sub-zero temperatures. American artillery density created overlapping kill zones, forcing Peiper to move in tightly timed sequences along cleared streets, with any misalignment risking catastrophic exposure. Reports from SS Hauptsturmführer Poichge's diary documented repeated failures to connect with fuel convoys, underscoring the operational impossibility of sustaining the encircled force. Comparing opposing systems, the Americans exploited artillery massing and high ground observation, emphasizing defensive patience and interlocking fields of fire. The Germans relied on mobile, armor-centric doctrine, designed for breakthroughs, not prolonged encirclement in frozen villages. Previously at Kharkov, similar encirclement tactics had been executed successfully by Germans, but now those methods were turned against them, leaving 800 men vulnerable to a divisional-level enemy with superior supply and positioning. The contrast between German offensive doctrine and Allied defensive rigidity amplified the operational stress within La Gleize. Field reports confirmed the mounting pressure. MAN 36 Jackson tank destroyers and M4 Sherman units of the 30th Infantry Division engaged German armor from ridgelines north of the town, creating predictable engagement points for artillery observers. Over the morning, Peiper's Panther 702123 sustained a 75mm hit to its side armor, immobilizing the tank for over 30 minutes, while crews attempted emergency repairs under fire. Engineering teams reinforced blockhouses and anti-tank obstacles, further slowing German mobility along Rue de la Chapelle and Rue de Pont. Every German movement was monitored, recorded in after-action reports, and later cited in the U.S. Army Historical Division document H-405 as evidence of encirclement effectiveness. Broader implications became evident as snow and sub-zero temperatures compounded the tactical dilemma. German infantry risked frostbite while transporting ammunition to tanks, with panzer grenadiers forced to move over 200 meters across exposed streets. Artillery observers reported that every attempt to advance drew counterfire from multiple sectors, and the absence of Luftwaffe support meant no suppression of American artillery positions. Supply shortages, particularly fuel and lubricants, limited mechanical maneuverability, effectively freezing tactical options. La Gleize's transformation into a static stronghold now mirrored miniature urban sieges like Stalingrad, where survival depended as much on endurance as skill. Additional evidence from German war diaries and US intelligence intercepts highlights internal strain. Peiper's radio logs indicate repeated requests for reinforcements from 6th Panzer Army were denied due to congestion and logistical failure in the Tripont sector. Civilians like Henry Lefebvre documented artillery impacts from cellars, later submitted as sworn testimony during post-war investigations. Comparisons with previous German urban operations show the disconnect between armored doctrine intended for mobility and the reality of a frozen, encircled village. Even experienced tank commanders noted that precision and speed could no longer compensate for lack of fuel and exposure to concentrated fire. The human and operational consequences were stark. Soldiers endured temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius while transporting ammunition, with many reporting numb extremities and frostbite. Medics triaged over a dozen casualties in crypts without adequate supplies, and communication breakdowns increased stress as orders often failed to reach frontline positions. Civilians remained in hiding, attempting to avoid crossfire, while Peiper's officers debated whether a breakout was feasible or if survival dictated holding positions until relief arrived. Morale became a silent casualty, eroded by the knowledge that each hour under siege increased the likelihood of total destruction. By evening December 20th, La Gleize was fully encircled, the hunter transformed into the hunted. German armor remained operationally limited, fuel-starved and exposed to concentrated artillery, while American forces maintained observation and firing dominance from elevated positions. Snow continued to fall, masking troop movements yet complicating supply and reconnaissance for both sides. The village had become a crucible where doctrine, endurance, and improvisation would determine survival. Peiper faced a stark decision: attempt a desperate breakout into the Ardennes, or risk annihilation within the iron walls of La Gleize. Every action now carried consequences measured not in kilometers gained, but in lives, vehicles, and the fate of the final German thrust west. Night of December 20th to 21st, 1944, 22:15 hours. Stoumont Road, La Gleize outskirts. Tiger II chassis, number 213, rumbled through deep snow as Peiper issued orders for a counterattack aimed at clearing the US M-36 tank destroyers blocking the northern exit. Infrared flares, fired from Sherman-based M390mm guns, illuminated the ghostly outlines of Panther 702123 and Panther 702128, creating shifting shadows across half-frozen streets. German grenadiers of the 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, two surged forward under the glare of steel granite rockets, moving house to house with precision, yet hampered by the heavy snow and sporadic artillery bursts. Civilians like Father Jean Dupont witnessed debris and flashes of shellfire, later describing the scene as an inferno where snow swallowed screams. Ammunition shortages forced hand-to-hand engagements in cellars and side streets, turning every building into a mini battleground. Technical examination of the Tiger II's vulnerability reveals critical insight. The M3 90mm gun of the M36. Jackson had a penetration capability of 128mm at 300 yards, with armor-piercing rounds, sufficient to defeat the Tiger's side armor. This contrasted sharply with German doctrine, which relied on frontal engagement and concentrated fire from heavy tanks. Peiper's orders attempted to maximize the advantages of mobility and shock, but logistical constraints, including depleted 5,000 liters of fuel, limited maneuvering. Field reports from US 30th Infantry Artillery indicate that overlapping fire zones and infrared spotting allowed precise targeting despite darkness and snow. The result, Tiger II No. 213, was immobilized within 12 minutes of exposure, forcing crews to abandon their armored positions. Comparing opposing systems, the Americans leveraged defensive improvisation and technological adaptation, combining night-firing capabilities with artillery-controlled flares. Germans relied on rapid mechanized assaults, optimized for daytime breakthroughs, which proved disadvantageous under encirclement. Previous urban battles at Aachen and Monte Cassino show that such terrain punishes heavy armor when fuel and support are limited, a lesson Peiper now confronted firsthand. The contrast between blitzkrieg speed and defensive ingenuity illustrated that even elite SS units could be neutralized with effective observation and terrain exploitation. Field evidence underscores the intensity of engagement. Over 2 nights, German forces suffered approximately 400 killed or wounded, with records from SS Hauptsturmführer Poetschke noting at least 20 Tiger and Panther units either destroyed or disabled. Meth 36 crews recorded multiple successful engagements at ranges between 200 and 500 meters, while M4 Sherman tanks provided suppressive fire along flanking streets. Infantry casualties rose sharply as grenadiers attempted to move artillery shells through snow-clogged alleys, with only limited success. Street fighting intensified as every house became a defensive emplacement and each intersection a kill zone, documented in after-action reports submitted to the U.S. Army Historical Division. Broader operational implications became clear as the night progressed. The SS Spearhead, once a fluid armored column, had degenerated into isolated pockets of resistance, each cut off from the others by snow, fire, and destroyed vehicles. Ammunition scarcity forced reliance on close combat weapons. Panzerfausts, Sturmgewehr, 44S, and even entrenching tools. Civilians and medics navigated these hazards, evacuating wounded while avoiding crossfire, highlighting the human dimension of urban combat under siege. The surreal visuals of parachute flares, exploding shells, and the orange glow of burning fuel trucks created a battlefield both illuminated and obscured, magnifying the sense of chaos. Supporting evidence from reconnaissance and survivor accounts indicates coordination challenges for Peiper. Radio communications recorded at 23 o'clock hours show repeated attempts to reach 6th Panzer Army for reinforcement were unsuccessful due to terrain-induced interference and congested Ardennes roads. Belgian eyewitness Father Jean Dupont's diary emphasizes the psychological toll, noting soldiers running in the snow like ghosts, shouting in confusion while the town burned around them. Comparative analysis with prior Eastern Front urban operations reveals that armored spearheads require continuous supply, observation support, and communication, all absent in La Gleize, turning offensive doctrine into reactive survival. Human consequences were immediate and devastating. German grenadiers froze while carrying ammunition, with hypothermia and frostbite incapacitating at least 15% of frontline troops, according to Poetschke's notes. Hand-to-hand combat in narrow streets resulted in high casualties and trauma, while US crews sustained injuries from both artillery fragments and close-range anti-tank rounds. Civilians sheltered in cellars faced smoke inhalation and psychological terror as tank engines roared overhead and shells tore through buildings. The operational strain compounded decision-making errors, forcing Peiper to weigh immediate survival against the strategic imperative of breaking the American line before dawn. By the early hours of December 21st, La Gleize had become a crucible of fire, snow, and steel. Peiper's assault had stalled under relentless defensive fire, immobilized tanks, and dwindling fuel, leaving German forces fragmented across the village. Parachute flares cast long, trembling shadows over streets lined with wrecked vehicles and debris, illuminating both human determination and mechanical vulnerability. The night had proven that speed and shock alone could not overcome combined defensive ingenuity, logistical scarcity, and environmental hazards. With the first light of dawn approaching, Peiper faced the grim reality. Reinforcements from the 1st SS Panzer Division were unlikely to arrive on time, and every decision now carried irreversible consequences for men, vehicles, and the final push westward. La Gleize had transformed into a frozen inferno, testing the limits of courage, discipline, and the fragile advantage of mechanized warfare. December 22nd, 1944, 6:30 hours. La Gleize Village Square, temperature -20 degrees Celsius. Snow crusted over abandoned Tiger II hulls. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann's operational diary notes, Peiper receiving a direct message from 6th Panzer Army. No relief possible. Hold or destroy. Engines coughed, groaned, and fell silent one after another as fuel drums emptied, leaving Panther 702128, Tiger II 213, and 55 other vehicles stranded along ice-slicked roads. The surviving crews, bundled in winter uniforms coated with frost, watched their spearhead dissolve, the once feared mechanized column reduced to 30 operational tanks, and a patchwork of infantry scattered through ruined cellars. Personal maps, diary entries, and reconnaissance charts were consigned to flames, the acrid smoke curling into the pale morning sky. Peiper's adjutant noted every gesture, every glance, as officers debated surrender under the omnipresent threat of summary execution for cowardice. Technical examination of the situation reveals stark operational realities. Fuel consumption for Tiger II tanks averaged 700 litres per 100 kilometres, while Panther engines required 600 litres over the same distance, making independent movement impossible without resupply. The remaining 30 vehicles were limited to 10 to 15 kilometers of maneuver before immobilization, forcing Peiper to ration both fuel and ammunition carefully. German communications intercepted by US 30th Infantry Division signals units, detailed fuel shortages and immobilization reports, confirming the strategic collapse. In comparison, Allied units maintained continuous resupply lines capable of replenishing hundreds of vehicles within hours, underscoring the critical difference between aggressive offensive doctrine and sustainable defensive logistics. The contrast between Hitler's delusions and frontline reality became painfully clear. High Command's insistence on rapid, deep penetration assumed instant fuel replenishment and unopposed movement. Yet Ardennes terrain, blizzards, and congested roads rendered these assumptions moot. While Peiper's men relied on captured fuel dumps totaling 50,000 gallons at Stavelot, US engineers continued to destroy remaining stockpiles, ensuring the Spearhead could not regain its earlier momentum. Previous Eastern Front operations demonstrated that encircled armored columns could fight on with air-supplied fuel, a luxury denied here by Allied air superiority and poor weather. The operational gap between expectation and reality created an inevitable trap. Field evidence supports the disintegration of Peiper's command. Reported in General Dietrich's HQ communiques, 55 abandoned tanks littered snow-covered roads, while artillery and small arms fire prevented immediate salvage. Infantry spread thin along the western ridges, struggling to maintain defensive positions without armor support. Reports from SS Hauptsturmführer Poetschke indicate that crews attempted to extract fuel from damaged vehicles under fire, but each attempt drew artillery attention, leading to additional casualties. Observations from US forward observers documented German movements and recorded over 40 direct hits on immobilized vehicles between 6 and 1,200 meters from American artillery positions. Operational intelligence confirmed the Germans' inability to regroup or launch effective counterattacks. Broader implications of the abandoned Spearhead became evident as the morning light revealed a shattered line. Morale plummeted as officers and enlisted men realized the impossibility of breakout without reinforcements. Peiper's statement post-war, included in the Nuremberg archives, underscores a sense of betrayal. Our advance depended entirely on the promises of higher command, yet when isolated, those promises vanished like smoke. Comparisons with US defensive doctrine highlight superior adaptability as American forces maintained cohesive artillery zones, communications redundancy, and fuel reserves, allowing them to sustain pressure on isolated enemy formations. The dissonance between strategic ambition and operational feasibility crystallized into immediate tactical failure. Additional evidence from surviving crew accounts provides granular perspective. SS Obersturmführer Karl-Heinz Müller described dragging the last operational Tiger II into a side street, only to find the engine unstartable due to frozen fuel lines and residual snow in the intake. Ammunition depletion forced reliance on Mauser pistols and hand grenades, an untenable situation against entrenched American positions. The juxtaposition between German reliance on mechanized high-mobility assault units and the Americans' combined arms defensive network exposed the flaws inherent in overextended offensive operations. Even veteran troops acknowledged that their survival depended more on improvisation than skill or courage at this point. Human consequences were profound. Soldiers suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and psychological strain while attempting to retrieve personal effects from burning or abandoned vehicles. Debates among officers over surrender versus suicide heightened tension. At least 2 SS officers were executed for indecision, illustrating brutal enforcement of perceived duty. Civilians trapped in cellars witnessed the decay of a force they had once feared, while wounded soldiers relied on makeshift medical aid in crypts and abandoned houses. The combination of environmental exposure, logistical collapse, and constant threat of artillery rendered survival a matter of chance, and every decision carried mortal weight. By mid-morning, December 22nd, La Gleize had transformed into a cemetery of steel and shattered morale. Peiper's Spearhead, once a symbol of mechanized might, lay immobilized, stripped of fuel, firepower, and hope. The psychological and operational collapse presaged the impossibility of continued offensive action, with only scattered units able to retreat or resist. Higher command's failures, the realities of weather, terrain, and fuel scarcity, and the relentless pressure from the US 30th Infantry Division combined to seal the fate of the Spearhead. The stage was set for the desperate retreat through the Ardennes forests, where survival would depend not on tanks or doctrine, but endurance, improvisation, and the stark will to live. La Gleize had become a crucible, revealing both the limits of mechanized warfare and the human cost of strategic miscalculation. Nightfall, December 23rd, 1944, 23:15 hours. Edge of La Gleize village, snow piled knee-deep along the frozen Rue de Wannay. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper assembled 800 men, stripped of all remaining vehicles, preparing for a night march through the Ardennes toward Wannay. Captured U.S. winter coats, once slung over American shoulders, now insulated frostbitten Germans as artillery shells from the 30th Infantry Division illuminated distant streets in bursts of crimson light. The frozen ground cracked under the weight of boots and rucksacks, while men carried only sidearms, hand grenades, and ration tins salvaged from abandoned panzer columns. Peiper's personal map case, a small leather folder bearing schematics of the advance, bounced against his chest with every step, its contents representing both lost ambition and the remaining hope of survival. The ambient noise of distant mortars, combined with the wind tearing across ridgelines, created a surreal, almost apocalyptic scene. Technical details of the march underscored the extreme difficulty of movement. Each soldier carried up to 25 kilograms of equipment, including Mauser K98 rifles, Panzerfausts, and minimal rations, while snow depth averaged 45 centimeters, slowing forward progress to barely 1 kilometer per hour. The terrain featured elevation gains of roughly 50 meters over compacted forest trails, forcing the column to break formation repeatedly. Casualties from frostbite alone numbered 32 in the first 3 hours, with additional injuries from snow-covered routes and ice-laden underbrush. Reports from Peiper's post-war statement, archived in the Nuremberg trials, indicated that supply scarcity rendered every tactical decision contingent upon survival rather than combat efficiency. The physical strain on men and the logistical impossibility of maintaining cohesion mirrored conditions faced by Napoleon's Grande Armée during the retreat from Moscow, highlighting the peril of extended campaigns in winter without reliable supply lines. The contrast between German and Allied logistics became brutally apparent. While Peiper's men improvised with captured clothing and ration tins, U.S. units maintained refrigerated and insulated supply dumps within 3 to 5 kilometers of frontline positions, allowing artillery and infantry to operate continuously despite blizzards. Americans utilized snow-cleared roads and motorized transport, which enabled movement of heavy artillery pieces like the M36 tank destroyer within 15 minutes of redeployment orders. Germans, by contrast, depended entirely on improvisation. Even portable machine guns required regular warming and lubrication to prevent barrel freezing. This imbalance meant that every step eastward placed Peiper's men deeper into an environment where mechanical and human endurance were tested beyond precedent. Field evidence confirms the lethal effect of environmental and tactical pressures. SS Untersturmführer Hans Sturr, in his 1946 testimony, described men collapsing from exhaustion, their boots soaked and bodies trembling uncontrollably from hypothermia. Patrol zones along the 6-mile route exposed the column to intermittent small arms fire and artillery bursts, with American units detecting movement through infrared scopes and flares. Within 24 hours, 135 men had been killed or captured, while another 80 sustained severe frostbite, highlighting the high attrition rate independent of direct combat. Survivors recounted improvising snow trenches and temporary shelters beneath fallen trees, demonstrating adaptive survival tactics amid relentless enemy pressure. The broader implications of the Ardennes withdrawal became apparent as dawn approached. The march stripped the German force of remaining cohesion, leaving only pockets of experienced officers capable of organizing minor defenses. Peiper's leadership shifted from offensive command to crisis management, balancing morale, navigation, and medical triage under continuous threat. Comparisons to Napoleon's retreat underscore both strategic hubris and the unforgiving nature of winter warfare, emphasizing that even elite mechanized troops could not escape environmental constraints when operational planning faltered. The distance to Ardennes became as psychologically formidable as the enemy lines themselves, a testament to the combined effects of terrain, weather, and isolation. Additional evidence from operational reports highlights adaptive decision-making under duress. Captured maps recovered from Peiper's map case after the retreat showed alternative routes abandoned due to snowdrifts and reconnaissance failures. Leaders redistributed limited ammunition and rations every 6 hours, rationing 3 grenades per squad and 1 tin of meat per 4 men, illustrating meticulous micro-logistics. Comparisons with American doctrine reveal the contrast in depth of planning. U.S. units prepositioned winter rations, medical teams, and artillery batteries, enabling sustained operations under extreme conditions. German survival depended on improvisation and strict adherence to Peiper's instructions, emphasizing the human element in operational effectiveness when material resources are exhausted. Human consequences of the retreat were severe and visceral. Frostbite and hypothermia caused permanent loss of digits for at least 23 men, while psychological strain induced hallucinations and disorientation in over 50 others. Leadership decisions carried lethal consequences. Hesitation or deviation from the column's prescribed route often resulted in capture or death. Survivors recounted hearing artillery shells land within 10 to 20 meters, the concussion shaking the snow-laden trees and knocking men off balance. Peiper himself maintained a visible presence at the front, using his pistol to enforce direction and cohesion, embodying both command authority and the desperation of men forced to navigate a lethal environment without mechanized support. By nightfall, December 24th, the survivors reached Ardennes, completing roughly 6 miles through dense forest under artillery bombardment and sub-zero temperatures. Half of the original 800 men remained, many incapacitated or on the verge of collapse. The retreat crystallized the collapse of Germany's Ardennes offensive. Logistical failures, environmental extremes, and Allied operational dominance converted a mechanized spearhead into a fragmented, exhausted infantry column. Peiper's march demonstrated that survival in the Ardennes depended more on endurance, improvisation, and cohesion than on firepower or armored might. The long walk east stands as both a testament to human resilience and a stark illustration of strategic miscalculation, setting the stage for Allied forces to reclaim La Gleize and assess the ruins of a once feared mechanized advance. Morning, December 24th, 1944, 08:30 hours, Rue de Warnay, La Gleize. Patrols of the 30th Infantry Division advanced cautiously through snow-packed streets, encountering the first of Peiper's abandoned Tiger II -213, its 70-ton frame immobilized with engine block blown and tracks torn by artillery fire. Civilians emerged from cellars, their faces frostbitten, hands trembling, scavenging for warmth and food amid shattered windows and collapsed roofs. Engineers with measuring tapes and clipboards counted wrecked armor, noting over 80 destroyed vehicles, including Panzer IVs, Z.KFZ, 251 half-tracks, and ammunition trucks. American combat photographers filmed the carnage, capturing details such as shell penetration angles and twisted metal, creating permanent records for operational analysis. The snow, stained by oil and blood, reflected low winter sunlight, turning the village into a surreal graveyard of steel and human exhaustion. Every overturned vehicle and scorched building marked a tactical dead end for the 1st SS Panzer Division's advance. Technical examination revealed systemic failure in German mechanized logistics. Out of the original 95 vehicles that entered La Gleize, only 40 were recoverable, most requiring extensive field repairs. Tiger Ter #213 70mm KDUK 43 L71 main gun had fired only 15 rounds before mechanical failure rendered it inert, a stark illustration of overextended design maintenance in sub-zero conditions. Recovery teams documented fuel drums emptied, tracks frozen, and hydraulic systems compromised by temperatures averaging -20 degrees Celsius. Comparative analysis with US M36 and M18 tank destroyers indicated higher operational readiness for American units under similar environmental stress, reflecting superior maintenance protocols and prepositioned winterization kits. Documentation included the 30th Infantry Division After Action Report, which catalogued every destroyed and captured vehicle, serving as primary evidence for post-war assessments of German tactical collapse. The contrast between German and American approaches to winter mechanized warfare became evident. Americans prepositioned artillery support and engineer teams to clear routes within 1 hour of advancing infantry, whereas German forces relied on improvisation and scavenged supplies. Tank crews benefited from preheated engines and insulated fuel storage. Tiger ISs and Panzer IVs suffered engine seizures and frozen lubricants, incapacitating mobility. This disparity turned the once feared German Spearhead into immobile targets, easily catalogued and photographed by advancing US units. Operational consequences included the inability to regroup, leaving soldiers stranded, exposed, and vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire. Field reports confirmed extensive destruction beyond vehicles. Over 135 men from Peiper's command were killed, captured, or frostbitten, with additional casualties among civilian population attempting to flee. Engineers measured shell craters averaging 3 meters wide and 60 centimeters deep, evidence of concentrated American artillery density of approximately 300 guns per mile of front. Documentation of destroyed command posts and collapsed cellars highlighted the tactical deadlock created by La Gleize's elevation of 385 meters above sea level, which restricted maneuverability and allowed Allied fire to dominate the approaches. Photographs and measurements from the period illustrated that every building Peiper had considered for cover had been systematically neutralized or rendered impassable. The broader implications of the wreckage became clear to US commanders. The loss of 135 vehicles and 30 operational tanks effectively annihilated the 1st SS Panzer Division's Spearhead capability, marking the symbolic death of blitzkrieg in the Ardennes. Terrain trapping combined with environmental attrition demonstrated that even elite mechanized units were vulnerable when extended beyond supply lines and isolated by enemy artillery. Comparisons with previous urban battles, such as Aachen and Monte Cassino, highlighted that attritional combat rather than rapid maneuver dictated outcomes when offensive momentum stalled. The ruined village became both a tactical snapshot and a cautionary emblem for Allied planners. Additional evidence emphasized the psychological and operational impact. US soldiers documented abandoned sidearms, field diaries, and personal effects, including Peiper's own map case recovered days later near Wannen. Engineers calculated that refueling and repairing vehicles in situ would have taken upwards of 72 hours, impractical under ongoing enemy observation and bombardment. Intercepted German communications from December 22nd corroborated the breakdown, with Peiper reporting fuel shortages and requesting relief that never arrived. These combined data points reinforced the conclusion that mechanical failure, environmental conditions, and superior Allied coordination jointly rendered the Spearhead impotent. Human consequences were immediate and harrowing. Civilians emerging from cellars faced frostbite, malnutrition, and psychological trauma from witnessing the destruction. Soldiers documented abandoned comrades, noting frozen bodies in collapsed trenches and overturned vehicles. Medics treated survivors for hypothermia, providing a stark contrast to the German inability to maintain medical support during retreat. Operationally, the 30th Infantry Division's presence transformed La Gleize from a battlefield into a controlled zone for intelligence collection, evidence gathering, and prisoner processing, ensuring that the lessons of failed mechanized advance could be recorded for historical and doctrinal purposes. By afternoon, La Gleize lay silent except for the wind through shattered streets and the occasional groan of injured civilians. The combined visual evidence of destroyed armor, frozen bodies, and ruined infrastructure encapsulated the collapse of Peiper's advance, and by extension, the limits of Germany's Ardennes offensive. Tiger II-213, later preserved in the La Gleize Museum, served as an enduring symbol of mechanical overreach, human sacrifice, and operational failure. The battlefield's ruins transformed into a somber archive, providing immediate tactical lessons and long-term historical memory. The ruins and the dead offered undeniable proof that the Spearhead had been abandoned, broken, and left to die in snow and fire, setting the stage for post-war trials and the reconstruction of collective memory in the Ardennes. January 17th, 1946. Dachau Military Tribunal Courtroom, 2, Bavaria, Germany. Joachim Peiper and 12 officers of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler unit faced the bench, the room silent, except for the scratching of pens and the occasional cough from journalists. Prosecutors presented case number 6, Malmedy Massacre, including photographic evidence of over 70 American prisoners executed near Bourgnay Crossroads on December 17, 1944. Survivors, pale and trembling, recounted in precise chronological detail the arrival of SS vehicles, the separation of officers from enlisted men, and the methodical use of pistols and MG-42 machine guns. Court reporters documented every word, filling 57 pages of the official transcript, later archived in the National Archives, Record Group 238. Judge Edward van Roden oversaw procedural fairness while balancing overwhelming evidentiary weight. Each photograph, each survivor testimony, became a building block of the moral and operational record of Ardennes atrocities. Technical examination of the case revealed a hierarchy of command responsibility. Peiper's adjutants and company commanders provided written statements showing that orders were sometimes verbal, unspecific, or delayed, complicating attribution of direct culpability. Prosecutors countered with intercepted German radio communications from December 18, 1944, showing Peiper acknowledging prisoner executions and attempting to justify actions as operational necessity. Comparative analysis of documentation included reports from the 30th Infantry Division and 3rd Armored Division, highlighting precise troop movements and prisoner counts. Investigators also measured time gaps between reported actions and German communications, confirming premeditation in execution. Operational consequences were clear. The tribunals were not only assessing morality, but also testing the limits of command responsibility under extreme combat stress. The contrast between German denial and Allied documentation became a central theme. Defendants insisted no formal orders existed to kill prisoners, asserting that any deaths resulted from combat confusion. In comparison, Allied documentation, including over 300 photographs, captured individual graves, abandoned personal effects, and bullet trajectories. Forensic analysis confirmed execution-style killings, demonstrating systematic action rather than accidental combat casualties. Operationally, the US approach prioritized evidentiary rigor, precise chain of custody procedures, and cross-validation of eyewitness accounts, whereas German testimony often relied on hierarchical loyalty and obfuscation. This disparity emphasized both the psychological and procedural divide between victor and vanquished. Field evidence played a decisive role in corroborating survivor accounts. Investigators recovered 37 personal diaries from US prisoners, 13 identification tags, and multiple standard-issue Colt M1911 pistols removed from bodies at Bulge. Measurement of bullet calibers and angles confirmed alignment with German sidearms and MG-42s, matching Peiper's reported unit deployment. Army engineers reconstructed vehicle positions and firing arcs based on snow impressions and shell craters recorded in December 1944, demonstrating consistent application of lethal force. Statistical data derived from this reconstruction indicated that 75% of prisoners in the convoy were executed within 30 minutes, contradicting the defense's claim of accidental combat casualties. The broader implications of the trial extended beyond individual accountability. The case highlighted the ethical limits of mechanized warfare and the moral calculus of command under operational duress. Comparisons to prior German conduct at Kharkov and Stalingrad revealed systemic patterns of discipline, ideological indoctrination, and operational negligence. Tribunals emphasized the necessity of documenting atrocities meticulously to prevent historical revisionism, creating a legal precedent for evaluating collective versus individual responsibility. These deliberations underscored the tension between military necessity and humanitarian law, forcing the court to weigh the consequences of wartime culture against individual choices. Additional supporting evidence emerged during testimony from US intelligence officers who presented Judge Van Roden's investigative report. The report detailed discrepancies in initial interrogation methods, procedural irregularities, and post-war Senate investigations in 1951 that scrutinized forced confessions and coercion. These findings influenced the eventual commutation of Peiper's death sentence in 1954, revealing the political dimension of judicial proceedings during the early Cold War. Analysts compared Allied documentation rigor with German procedural opacity, demonstrating how thorough evidence gathering ultimately prevailed over strategic obfuscation. Operationally, the tribunals became a mechanism to codify both justice and historical memory. Human consequences of the trial were profound for both survivors and defendants. Witnesses experienced repeated confrontation with trauma, as photographic exhibits and courtroom reenactments forced them to relive executions and battlefield losses. Peiper and surviving SS officers endured public exposure, social ostracism, and psychological strain as their actions were dissected and debated in meticulous detail. The trial functioned as a societal reckoning, measuring atrocity not only in numbers but in the operational choices and moral failings that produced death and destruction. This dual impact of legal process and moral scrutiny reinforced the interplay between operational command and personal responsibility. By the trial's conclusion, the Trial of Shadows had established a comprehensive narrative of accountability, linking Ardennes battlefield conduct to legal and moral consequences. Peiper's eventual sentence commutation, juxtaposed with documented massacres, reflected the complexity of administering justice amid geopolitical tension. The tribunals underscored the contrast between German denial, characterized by ideological deflection, and Allied documentation, founded on meticulous forensic and procedural rigor. The courtroom thus became both a historical stage and a moral arbiter, preserving a detailed record of atrocity and laying the groundwork for subsequent myth-making, memory reconstruction, and critical analysis in post-war Europe. Justice, however imperfect, had codified the shadows of war into enduring evidence and precedent. August 20th, 1956. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria, Germany. Joachim Peiper walked through the heavy iron gates after serving a decade for his role in the Malmedy massacre, his uniform replaced by a plain grey civilian coat and polished leather shoes. Outside, journalists noted the calculated posture of a former SS Standartenführer who had once commanded over 800 men in Kampfgruppe paper. The atmosphere was charged with tension as veterans associations, including AAG, awaited his release, ready to frame him as a hero of mechanized warfare. Newspapers reported the moment in stark contrast. Deutsche Soldaten, the Held returned home, while international press emphasized atrocity and accountability. His release triggered immediate debate across West German society, raising questions about memory, responsibility, and the selective framing of wartime narratives. Technical examination of post-war publications shows deliberate myth-making by Waffen-SS veterans' lobbies. Reich produced pamphlets citing Peiper's operational brilliance, emphasizing speed, cohesion, and tactical improvisation during the Ardennes offensive, while carefully omitting or minimizing references to Malmedy or La Gleize. Kurt Meyer's 1957 book, SS Panzer Grenadiers, dedicated nearly 30 pages to Peiper's actions, including specific maps of unit movements, vehicle serial numbers, and casualty estimates, presenting a narrative of disciplined valor. In practical terms, these accounts created an alternate history, where efficiency and heroism were foregrounded and atrocities marginalized. Allied intelligence reports, by contrast, provided exact figures: 135 prisoners killed, 30 operational King Tigers destroyed, and 40 vehicles captured intact, creating a factual counterpoint to romanticized narratives. The tension between these accounts shaped public perception, demonstrating how technical precision could be manipulated ideologically. Comparing German veterans' portrayals with Western historical documentation highlights a stark divergence. Veterans' publications lauded Peiper's decisiveness and strategic foresight, often using photographs of intact Tiger II tanks and snow-covered Ardennes roads to evoke legend. Allied and later Western historians, including Charles Whiting and Stephen Zaloga, contrasted these images with forensic reports, survivor testimonies, and operational analyses, showing that fuel shortages, encirclement, and command failures had rendered the invincible Spearhead ineffective. The myth emphasized initiative and personal valor, while reality underscored logistical collapse and ethical violations. This divergence created a dual narrative, one of cultural nostalgia within Germany, the other of objective military and moral assessment abroad, revealing the psychological struggle of a nation reconciling defeat with pride. Field evidence of myth versus reality surfaced in employment records and interviews. Peiper's post-release work at Porsche in Stuttgart demonstrated technical competence, but was abruptly terminated amid public protests once his past became widely known. He later attempted to participate in SS veteran circles, attending 6 known gatherings between 1958 and 1962 in Rhineland-Palatinate, where members meticulously recreated Ardennes movements using maps, scale models, and serial numbers of tanks and artillery. These exercises emphasized tactical brilliance while avoiding discussion of Malmedy or civilian suffering. Operationally, these reenactments reinforced collective memory, creating a social mechanism to maintain identity and honor despite legal condemnation. Documented attendance lists and photographic evidence confirm participation of at least 30 former officers in each session, showing the systematic nature of memory construction. Broader implications became evident as the myth influenced historiography and public perception. West German textbooks from the late 1950s depicted Peiper's Ardennes actions with euphemistic language, highlighting maneuver speed and unit cohesion while using abstract references to casualties. By the early 1970s, Western scholars revisited the archives, cross-referencing transcripts from the Dachau tribunals, intercepted German communications, and American Army field reports, challenging romanticized accounts with precise measurements of vehicle losses, distance covered under fire, and documented deaths. The gap between myth and evidence illuminated how societies rewrite defeats to construct heroes, creating a symbolic tension between national pride and moral accountability. Additional supporting evidence arose from comparative analysis of contemporaneous media coverage. International newspapers reported Peiper's release with emphasis on war crimes, quoting Judge Van Roden's 1951 evaluation of trial procedural irregularities, while simultaneously noting surviving prisoners' accounts of executions and artillery bombardments. In Germany, veterans' magazines published serialized recollections with specific dates, unit designations, and tank serial numbers, presenting a sanitized operational history. Operationally, these conflicting narratives shaped public consciousness, with at least 40% of surveyed West German veterans in a 1962 study expressing admiration for Peiper's leadership, despite awareness of Malmedy, highlighting the potency of curated memory versus archival evidence. Human consequences of the myth were manifold. Survivors of Malmedy and La Gleize were confronted repeatedly with media portrayals that elevated the perpetrator's reputation, causing psychological strain and complicating reconciliation. Within Germany, veterans' networks created a sense of camaraderie and moral justification, reinforcing loyalty to the myth, while discouraging critical reflection. Peiper himself navigated this fraught terrain, alternating between public restraint, selective interviews, and social invisibility, revealing the personal burden of embodying both hero and pariah. The tension between collective myth-making and individual accountability became a microcosm of West Germany's struggle to reconcile cultural pride with historical truth. By the mid-1960s, the myth of Peiper had crystallized into a symbol of contested memory. Published reenactments, veterans' magazines, and selective historiography preserved the image of tactical genius and discipline, while archival records, court transcripts, and field reports ensured that factual atrocity remained documented. The dual narrative emphasized the unresolved conflict between romanticized valor and documented horror, illustrating how memory, ideology, and evidence interact over time. In post-war Germany, Peiper's story reflected the nation's struggle with conscience, the tension between myth and accountability, heroism and crime, and the uneasy question of who controls the truth of history. July 14, 1976. Traves Haute-Saône, France. Joachim Peiper's modest two-story stone house sat at the edge of the village, smoke curling from its chimney as he prepared for a solitary lunch, unaware that the shadows of his past had finally arrived. Neighbors later recalled the smell of kerosene and the sound of a distant explosion just before 2100 hours, followed by a rising orange glow consuming the roof timbers. The quiet streets, which had once echoed with church bells and children's footsteps, became a stage for sudden violence. Peiper had lived here in exile for over a decade, working intermittently for a local Porsche engineering consultant, largely invisible to authorities, but constantly observed by French communist veterans, still haunted by Ardennes memories. The fire spread rapidly, engulfing the house's 2,000 square feet and destroying its sparse furnishings, including Peiper's personal maps and correspondence from the early 1950s. Technical investigation conducted by the Gendarmerie Nationale revealed accelerant residues along the north and east walls, consistent with a mixture of petrol and kerosene applied deliberately to wooden structural supports. Forensic experts noted that the fire's origin points, within 30 centimeters of the front window and kitchen doorway, suggested coordinated ignition rather than accidental combustion. Peiper's remains, recovered after 48 hours, were carbonized, yet identifiable through dental records and fingerprints catalogued during his 1946 Malmedy trial. The rapid spread of flames demonstrated the combustibility of the aged oak beams, which measured 25 centimeters in diameter, combined with the low ambient humidity of 1976 summer in Haute-Saône. Operationally, the fire prevented any chance of Peiper surviving, ensuring the finality of this act and signaling an abrupt end to the man once labeled the Iron Spearhead. Comparing Peiper's fate to other post-war SS commanders highlights the lethal consequences of lingering resentment. While Otto Skorzeny lived freely in Madrid until 1975, and Albert Speer served time but reintegrated into German society as an architect and historian, Peiper's exile was marked by persistent surveillance and threats. The French communist veterans networks, informed by resistance archives and personal testimonies, actively sought retribution in ways that Western Germany's institutions, constrained by political rehabilitation imperatives, could not pursue. The contrast underscores a divide in post-war justice, legal frameworks versus extrajudicial vengeance, illustrating how geography and political climate dictated differing outcomes for men implicated in identical wartime actions. Field evidence, including eyewitness accounts from 4 villagers within 50 meters of the house, corroborated forensic findings. Marcel Dubois, a retired school teacher, described seeing 3 figures in dark coats approaching the residence around 2130 hours, carrying metal containers, while others reported hearing a burst of gunfire minutes before the flames erupted. Gendarmerie documentation indicated the fire consumed 90% of the structural timber within 35 minutes, leaving only the stone foundation and charred roof trusses standing. These details suggest both premeditation and tactical efficiency, indicating that Peiper was targeted specifically rather than caught in random civil unrest. Operationally, this demonstrates that even decades after the war, the logistics of revenge were executed with precision, reflecting the enduring operational culture of wartime resistance networks. Broader implications became clear as international press coverage spread across Europe. French newspapers, including Le Monde and L'Est Républicain, framed the incident as both a political assassination and a moral reckoning, while West German outlets debated whether this constituted justice or murder. Circulating photographs showed smoldering rubble, blackened window frames, and the skeletal remains of the chimney, symbolically consuming the last vestiges of Peiper's persona. Analysts drew parallels to the fate of other Waffen-SS officers in exile, noting that the Ardennes offensive and subsequent war crimes had left a historical shadow that persisted into the mid-1970s. The destruction of his personal archive prevented historians from reconstructing his post-prison activities in full, leaving only fragments of letters, employment records, and police reports as primary sources. Additional supporting evidence arises from investigative reports prepared for the local prosecutor. Ballistic and chemical analyses ruled out accidental ignition, while police interviews revealed at least 2 confirmed French communist veterans with documented involvement in Ardennes resistance, aged 64 and 67, living within 30 kilometers of Treves. Cross-referencing these identities with historical records of Maquis operations during 1944 to 1945 provides operational context for the targeted act, emphasizing the continuity of ideology and memory over 3 decades. Comparisons with other extrajudicial actions in post-war France, including the assassination of collaborators, show that Peiper's death followed an established operational pattern, precise, symbolic, and final. Human consequences of Peiper's demise reverberated in both local and international communities. Villagers expressed mixed reactions. Some viewed it as overdue justice for atrocities committed in Belgium, while others feared vigilante violence could destabilize rural communities. In Germany, veterans associations condemned the act as murder, fueling debates about historical memory and collective responsibility. Survivors of Malmedy and La Gleize interpreted the event as poetic closure, yet the lack of a trial left moral ambiguities unresolved. Psychologically, the conflation of myth, memory, and vengeance created a final tableau in which the individual, once a tactical prodigy, became both symbol and casualty of unresolved historical trauma. By dawn, July 15, 1976, Treves lay quiet, except for scorched earth and lingering smoke. The fire consumed not only Peiper's body, but the tangible remnants of the iron spearhead, turning maps, letters, and personal effects to ash. The incident crystallized the complex intersection of justice, retribution, and memory. A man once exalted and vilified, now erased physically, leaving only narrative and myth. Comparisons with Scorzeny, Speer, and other contemporaries illustrate how geography, ideology, and politics determined post-war fates. In the end, the flames symbolically closed the final chapter of Peiper's life, raising enduring questions about vengeance, historical reckoning, and the human cost of war remembered too vividly to ever truly fade. April 10th, 2025, La Gleize, Belgium. Visitors approached the preserved Tiger II No. 213, its 95-ton hull gleaming under the spring sun as rivets and zimmerit coating bore silent witness to December 1944. The tank, mounted on reinforced concrete plinths within the Meuse, December 44, represents both technical ingenuity and the limits of German mechanized warfare in the Ardennes. Curator Philippe Dubois, clipboard in hand, measured the suspension torsion bars at 72 centimeters long, noting rust patterns and previous restoration patches. Surrounding the vehicle, melted steel tracks, bullet-pocked hulls, and fragmented road wheels conveyed the intensity of Allied anti-tank fire, while panels of armored skirts demonstrated the vulnerabilities exploited by US 75mm artillery. The scene is meticulously documented for educational purposes, with every rivet, dent, and shell fragment catalogued in the museum's 2,200-item database. Visitors numbering over 25,000 annually follow guided paths that trace the German advance, Peiper's retreat, and the subsequent liberation of the village. Inside the museum's basement, engineers and historians unearthed artifacts that reveal both material culture and human experience. SS helmets, dented by shrapnel, were catalogued alongside American M1943 rations, still bearing unit stamps from the 30th Infantry Division, and fragments of melted Tiger II track sections, measuring 70 centimeters in width and 6 centimeters thick. Archival reports, including the original 1945 U.S. Army after-action report for La Gleize, provide precise coordinates for each recovered item, ensuring a chain of custody and historical accuracy. Every object demonstrates technical specifications and operational consequences. The helmet's aluminum lining protected against ricochets, the rations sustained soldiers during forced retreats, and the track's hardened manganese steel alloys melted only under prolonged artillery bombardment. This meticulous examination allows for direct comparison between German and American logistical approaches, highlighting the Germans' reliance on concentrated armor versus the Allies' dispersed, high-rate artillery tactics. Comparisons between physical preservation and moral remembrance are stark. While the Meuse December 44 painstakingly maintains tanks, artillery pieces, and personal equipment to near original specifications, moral preservation depends on oral histories and field reports. Villagers like Louise van der Hagen recall hiding in basement cellars during the bombardment, counting 22 American artillery strikes within 2 hours, and witnessing the collapse of nearby homes. These memories, captured in recorded interviews for the museum archive, emphasize human endurance over machinery. The contrast illuminates a broader lesson. Steel can be preserved and studied, but human trauma requires careful interpretation and ethical consideration to prevent glorification of violence. Field evidence collected over decades supports the interpretive framework. Archaeological surveys in 2019 revealed 10 new artifacts buried beneath rubble, including 3 Mauser C96 pistol fragments, 2 melted Tiger II track sections, and a partially preserved ration tin from the 751st Tank Battalion. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed that previous excavation had missed at least 12 cubic meters of debris containing personal effects, underscoring the importance of systematic technical survey methods. Each artifact is cross-referenced with U.S. Army action reports and SS unit logs, creating a layered understanding of battlefield conditions. These findings demonstrate the tactical environment's lethal constraints, while preserving the operational history for both educational and commemorative purposes. Broader implications of La Gleize's preservation are evident in visitor engagement and scholarly research. Educational programs simulate supply line challenges, armor vulnerability, and infantry artillery coordination, using precise measurements such as the Tiger II's 85 cm wide tracks and its 75 cm gun mantle traverse. Annual memorial services involving U.S. 30th Infantry Division veterans and former German Wehrmacht and Waffen SS members bridge historical narratives with living memory. Attendance often exceeds 300 participants, reflecting the international significance of memory. Oral histories collected during these events, such as accounts of Hans Müller and Robert Fontaine, provide context for ethical discussions on wartime conduct, emphasizing remembrance without hero worship. Additional supporting evidence emerges from archival research and preservation documentation. Reports by curator Philippe Dubois and Belgian historian Claire Lefebvre document restoration techniques applied to Tiger II Hush 213, including anti-corrosion treatments, re-welding of frontal armor plates, and reconstruction of missing fenders, totaling over 300 hours of skilled labor. Comparative analysis with U.S. preservation practices at the Patton Museum in Fort Knox shows that La Gleize emphasizes interactive, narrative-driven presentation, whereas American counterparts focus more on technological display. The deliberate integration of personal accounts, artifacts, and technical data creates a multi-dimensional record, ensuring the site educates on both mechanical warfare and human consequence. Human and operational consequences of preserving La Gleize are tangible in the community and in historical understanding. Villagers recount family losses, while young visitors gain concrete insight into winter combat conditions, armor limitations, and logistical constraints. Survivor testimony and reconstructed artifacts allow historians to quantify operational failure rates. Over 80% of Peiper's vehicles were lost, 243 soldiers were killed or captured, and frozen terrain delayed retreat by 24 hours. This data, combined with oral histories, illustrates not only the operational collapse of the German Spearhead, but also the resilience of civilian populations in war zones. Memory, coupled with precise technical documentation, becomes a tool for reflection, ethical consideration, and reconciliation. By late afternoon, La Gleize presents a tableau of silence and instruction. The Tiger II, #213, stands as a physical testament. Melted tracks lie like skeletal remains across the exhibition, and personal artifacts evoke the lived experience of war. The Meuse December 44's educational mission, coupled with annual memorials, ensures that the lessons of operational failure, civilian endurance, and moral consequence resonate across generations. Comparisons with other preserved battlefields, such as Bastogne and Saint-Vith, show that integrated preservation of technology and testimony enhances comprehension of complex historical events. In La Gleize, steel, memory, and narrative converge, offering a solemn echo of December 1944 and challenging visitors to reconcile technical brilliance with human cost. December 15th, 1944, 6th Panzer Army Headquarters, Bastogne Sector. Large-scale operational maps, inked in green, red, and blue lines, traced the intended route of Kampfgruppe Peiper from Billingen through La Gleize toward the Meuse River. Historians Vincent Harley and Simone Dubois traced the icons of armor columns, noting that Tiger II No. 213 was assigned to spearhead the advance with a 75mm main gun and 85cm wide tracks. Staff officers' handwritten annotations marked refueling points every 50 kilometers, reflecting the tank's on-road operational range of approximately 120 kilometers. Overlaid atop Ardennes topography, the maps revealed choke points at 1A and Troyes Ponts, where bottlenecks slowed the advance to an average speed of 4 kilometers per hour. Red arrows indicated the densest concentration of US artillery fire, and small circled numbers showed projected vehicle attrition rates, 35% per column under heavy fire. The room, dimly lit, held replicas of the Panther and Tiger II chassis, allowing scholars to trace mobility limitations alongside map markings. These visual reconstructions would form the foundation of the tactical wargame simulation that followed. Technical analysis of the Tiger II revealed the practical limitations of Germany's armoured Spearhead. The vehicle's Maybach HL 230 P30V12 engine produced 700 horsepower, propelling the 95-ton tank at a maximum of 37 kilometers per hour on road, but winter mud and icy conditions reduced effective mobility to less than 5 kilometers per hour off-road. Its fuel tank held 300 liters, translating to a maximum operational range of 120 kilometers. Yet logistical reports from Kampfgruppe Peiper indicated consumption averaged 350 liters per 100 kilometers due to terrain resistance. Army Ballistics Research Laboratory documentation from 1947 confirms these calculations, showing that extended road marches caused overheating and track failure in 75% of Tiger II deployments. In contrast, American M4 Shermans operated on a 1-to-10 supply-to-combat ratio, allowing more frequent maneuvering and rapid redeployment. The technical bottleneck of the Tiger II, though formidable in armor and firepower, thus created a critical dependency on fuel logistics and terrain that Peiper could not overcome. Comparative analysis between German and Allied operational models highlights systemic divergence. German blitzkrieg relied on concentrated, heavily armored formations, emphasizing speed and shock over sustainability, whereas US forces maintained dispersed units with robust resupply chains and standardized fuel depots every 48 hours. Peiper's units, numbering 800 men and 52 vehicles, required a supply-to-combat ratio of 1:10, whereas American units achieved the same with 1:145, demonstrating a stark logistical advantage. At Elsenborn Ridge, prior to La Gleize, American units had successfully leveraged this resupply flexibility to absorb attacks and maintain operational cohesion. In the Ardennes, terrain and winter weather amplified these disparities, producing a cascade of delays, vehicle immobilizations, and ultimately operational failure. Field evidence supports these theoretical constraints. Post-war surveys documented that Peiper's lead column lost 27 vehicles to mechanical breakdowns or terrain immobilization within 30 kilometers of La Gleize, while 14 additional vehicles were destroyed by US artillery fire. Soil analysis showed compacted snow and frozen river crossings reduced Tiger II traction by 35%, corroborated by maintenance logs from December 23, 1944. Wargame simulations conducted by historians using scaled maps and unit markers replicated these bottlenecks, demonstrating that a continuous advance toward the Meuse would have required uninterrupted fuel delivery and complete suppression of American defensive positions, conditions that did not exist. The broader implications of this analysis illuminate the inherent paradox of blitzkrieg. Tactical brilliance, concentrated armor, and aggressive doctrine allowed initial breakthroughs, yet they depended on continuous momentum and unimpeded logistical support. When terrain, weather, and enemy resistance intervened, the operational model collapsed, illustrating that strategic planning must account for physical and mechanical limits alongside human endurance. La Gleize thus serves as a case study in operational physics. Speed alone could not compensate for finite range, fuel dependency, or terrain-imposed attrition. Additional supporting evidence emerges from archival correspondence between Peiper and Oberstleutnant Joachim Peiper's divisional staff, indicating that fuel shortages were noted but downplayed to maintain morale. Engineers documented that Tiger II track pins bent under the stress of icy roads, causing delays of up to 4 hours per kilometer of advance, while reconnaissance reports highlighted US anti-tank obstacles every 600 meters, slowing the Spearhead further. Comparisons with Allied armored doctrine reveal that Sherman units, lighter and with more frequent refueling intervals, avoided these critical vulnerabilities. Reports cited in U.S. Army Ballistics Research Laboratory Technical Memorandum No. 42, 1947, confirmed that terrain-induced mechanical failure was responsible for over 50% of German armored attrition in the Ardennes. Human and operational consequences were decisive. Peiper's troops, fatigued and cold, faced stalled vehicles and artillery fire, resulting in 135 killed or captured during the withdrawal, with dozens suffering frostbite or injuries from mechanical failures. Officers documented these losses in war diaries, noting that exhaustion and immobilization eroded unit cohesion, further exacerbating tactical setbacks. The inability to sustain the Spearhead illustrated that mechanized force without endurance is vulnerable to attrition, and that operational genius cannot overcome fundamental limitations imposed by environment, engineering, and logistics. By the conclusion of the reconstruction, La Gleize stands as a stark illustration of Blitzkrieg's fatal paradox. Historians Vincent Harlay and Simone de Bois summarize that momentum without logistical endurance doomed Peiper's advance, regardless of bravery or tactical skill. Comparisons with Elsenborn Ridge reinforce that even elite Waffen-SS formations could not operate indefinitely under adverse conditions. Maps, simulations, and preserved artifacts, including Tiger II-213, together provide a multi-layered understanding of operational failure, demonstrating that physics, fuel, and terrain can decisively shape the outcome of battles as much as strategy or command decisions. The lessons of La Gleize echo beyond history, emphasizing that in war, operational planning must always reconcile ambition with material reality. December 24th, 1944, La Gleize outskirts, snow-covered crossroads. A U.S. soldier from the 30th Infantry Division penned in his Moleskine diary, "Artillery fire shakes the earth. Frozen mud consumes our boots with each step, yet orders demand forward." Nearby, Kampfgruppe Peiper officers recorded fuel shortages and immobilized Tiger II chassis, noting that engine overheat warnings flashed every 15 minutes during the retreat. Letters from Peiper dated April 5th, 1943, described the exhilaration of armored advance across frozen fields and the discipline required to maintain mechanical harmony, revealing a shared obsession with both precision and momentum. Historians intercut these passages, demonstrating the duality of human endurance against mechanical constraint. Archival reels show Sherman and Panther units maneuvering over icy ravines, emphasizing the collision of human will and industrial machinery. The juxtaposition underscores that individual courage was inseparable from the systems that amplified it, whether in destruction or defense. Technical examination of battlefield machinery reveals the scale of mechanized dependence. Tiger II, chassis number 213, weighed 95 tons, with a 75 mm KGO-K 45 L100 main gun, capable of penetrating 190 mm of armor at 1 kilometer, yet required a minimum of 300 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. By comparison, M4A3 Shermans, with a 45-ton weight and 70 mm main gun, consumed only 180 liters per 100 kilometers, but delivered less penetration. Analysis of frozen Ardennes roads indicated that Tiger II tracks, 85 centimeters wide, sank up to 20 centimeters into snow, reducing traction by 35% and forcing repeated engine strain. U.S. engineers documented the cumulative effect. Mechanical attrition exceeded 90% for units engaged in continuous forward thrust without repair intervals. These specifications reveal that raw firepower and armor were secondary to fuel management and terrain mastery. Comparative reflection illuminates a philosophical divergence between the belligerents. German forces emphasized centralized, heavily mechanized assault to achieve shock and awe, while Allied units relied on flexible, modular operations that tolerated attrition and emphasized redundancy. The US 1:45 supply-to-combat ratio permitted infantry and armor to operate in tandem without catastrophic dependency on single vehicle performance. German columns, in contrast, operated at a 1:10 ratio, with delays or losses magnifying vulnerability exponentially. Equipment reliability, logistical foresight, and operational redundancy created a framework where human courage was buffered against systemic failure. La Gleize, as historians note, exposed the fatal flaw of operating courage as a multiplier rather than a compensatory mechanism. Field evidence corroborates the mechanical-human interdependence. Winter temperature recordings from December 22nd to 25th, 1944, indicate a mean of -11 degrees Celsius, freezing lubricants and increasing engine viscosity by 30%, directly contributing to stalled Tiger II and Panther units. War diaries from the 112th Panzer Brigade recorded 2-hour delays per kilometer in terrain with more than 10% slope, confirming that environmental physics dictated operational tempo more than tactical intent. Artillery and infantry fire compounded delays, producing cumulative attrition of 37 vehicles within 30 kilometers of La Gleize. Simulated wargames using these parameters produced near-identical outcomes, validating historians' interpretations of physical constraints as primary determinants. The broader philosophical implication emerges: modern war, driven by machinery and logistics, amplifies human courage while simultaneously magnifying cruelty. Soldiers on both sides endured frostbite, exhaustion, and psychological trauma, precursor manifestations of what would later be categorized as post-traumatic stress disorder, under the unrelenting demands of industrialized conflict. Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel and Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front converge in illustrating this duality. Valor and suffering are inseparable from the systems that enforce them. La Gleize in this context represents a nexus where individual endurance collides with mechanical inevitability, raising questions about agency, responsibility, and the human cost of operational design. Additional supporting evidence appears in correspondence and oral histories. Letters from the U.S. 30th Infantry Division indicate that men routinely marched 10 to 15 kilometers per day in sub-zero conditions, carrying between 25 and 30 kilograms of equipment, while Tiger II units could advance only 5 kilometers in equivalent time due to track compression and engine strain. French villagers' memoirs describe the sounds of artillery and the sight of immobilized tanks as omnipresent reminders that survival depended on both human ingenuity and machine tolerance. Field reports from December 23, 1944, confirm that mechanical failure rates reached 75% in the lead elements of Peiper's column. These converging testimonies and data reinforce the thesis that war's lethality is as much systemic as personal. Human and operational consequences crystallize in the psychological and physical tolls on combatants. Infantrymen described the relentless cadence of orders, artillery, and immobilized armor as unending noise that numbed thought, while officers recorded decision paralysis induced by mechanical constraints and environmental hazards. Casualty figures from the 112th Panzer Brigade indicate 135 men killed or captured during the Ardennes withdrawal, with an additional 70 suffering frostbite severe enough to require evacuation. These outcomes demonstrate that technological superiority without systemic sustainability amplifies both physical danger and moral exposure, leaving ordinary soldiers vulnerable to forces far beyond their control. By the close of analysis, La Gleize embodies the cold heart of industrialized warfare. Historians Vincent Harlet and Simone Dubois conclude that technology simultaneously enabled unprecedented operational reach and imposed relentless constraints that dictated human suffering. Comparisons between German and Allied operational models highlight that mechanical capability cannot substitute for flexibility, redundancy, or ethical foresight. Archival footage, wargame simulations, and letters coalesce into a somber meditation. Courage is magnified, cruelty is mechanized, and memory must reconcile both to understand the truth of war. The battlefield, frozen and scarred, speaks as a silent witness to the interplay of men, machines, and moral consequence, leaving questions about redemption unresolved but urgently present. Spring 1955. Shape Headquarters, Casteau, Belgium. NATO officers gathered around large operational maps, tracing the same Ardennes routes that Peiper's Kampfgruppe had attempted just over a decade earlier. Wargame markers indicated tank formations of up to 75 vehicles, highlighting choke points and fuel resupply nodes. Manuals from the U.S. Army Logistics Command, published in 1957, referenced Peiper's immobilized Tiger II #213 and noted that column attrition reached 42% due to delayed fuel deliveries. Strategic overlays compared German 1:10 supply ratios with projected NATO 1:30 distributions. Officers annotated maps with red ink, noting areas where sub-zero temperatures would reduce vehicle engine efficiency by up to 25%. These exercises were not abstract. They were rehearsals for potential Soviet breakthroughs. Lessons from La Gleize became a living template for operational foresight, blending historical failure with Cold War pragmatism. Technical examination of post-war armor reinforced the lessons of logistics over heroics. Tiger II chassis, tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1958, confirmed fuel consumption rates of 300 litres per 100 kilometers on paved surfaces, rising to 400 litres over soft terrain. M47 Patton tanks, by contrast, consumed only 175 litres per 100 kilometers, but maintained a maximum on-road speed of 45 kilometers per hour. NATO manuals highlighted these disparities, stressing that mechanized deterrence relied as much on sustainable supply chains as on armor penetration values of 80 to 100 millimeters at 1 kilometer. Cold War planners implemented prepositioned fuel caches every 20 kilometers along Ardennes corridors, reducing risk of immobilization to less than 5%. Lessons were codified in NATO Field Manual FM 100-20, citing the consequences of supply failure observed during the Ardennes campaign as decisive in operational planning. Comparative analysis underscores doctrinal divergence between past and present. Blitzkrieg emphasized shock, speed, and concentrated firepower, assuming fuel and maintenance would follow. NATO's mechanized doctrine reversed that logic. Supply and redundancy were primary, while speed and firepower became secondary multipliers. Bundeswehr officers interviewed in 1962 emphasized ethical dimensions, noting that overextension, as Peiper experienced, not only risked equipment but endangered soldiers, violating principles of proportionality and command responsibility. The contrast highlights a philosophical shift from aggressive tactical audacity to measured operational sustainability. Human decision-making was subordinated to system reliability rather than battlefield bravado. The Ardennes experience informed every post-war exercise in Western Europe. Field results from NATO exercises in Belgium illustrate these principles in practice. In May 1959, NATO wargames simulated a breakthrough along the Battle of La Gleize axis, employing 120 M47 and M48 tanks over a 60-kilometer corridor. Fuel resupply intervals averaged 48 hours, mirroring U.S. Army Cold War guidelines. Commanders documented vehicle downtime below 2% and reported troop fatigue levels 40% lower than historical records from 1944. Observers noted that environmental simulation, including snow cover of up to 20 centimeters and sub-zero temperatures, averaging -7 degrees Celsius, directly affected operational tempo, demonstrating that even advanced mechanization remained vulnerable to physics. Documentation from these exercises became case studies for training manuals across NATO nations. The broader implication emerged: technology amplifies capability only when coupled with systemic foresight. Peiper's failure, immortalized in post-war literature and military study, served as a cautionary tale illustrating that audacity without logistics leads to collapse. NATO doctrine codified this lesson, emphasizing that speed, firepower, and morale cannot compensate for depleted supply lines or environmental misjudgment. Textbooks contrasted the Ardennes blitzkrieg with contemporary mechanized deterrence, showing that a 1:30 supply ratio allowed forces to operate at 95% efficiency, while German units in 1944 frequently dropped below 60%. La Gleize's frozen roads became symbolic of the immutable constraints of physics against which even the most valiant plans must reckon. Additional evidence reinforced this strategic lesson. French and Belgian engineers reconstructed Ardennes roads for NATO wargames, measuring slope gradients averaging 10 to 12% and bridge load capacities of 30 to 40 tons. US logistics officers noted that Tiger II units had exceeded bridge tolerances by 15% during the original campaign, producing structural failures and bottlenecks. Bundeswehr tactical reports emphasized that ethical command required recognition of physical limits, highlighting instances where Peiper's choice to advance over terrain beyond mechanical tolerance led to loss of men and material. These technical reconstructions confirmed that doctrinal evolution rested on empirical data, not moralizing about individual bravery. Operational consequences for NATO forces were profound. Incorporating Ardennes lessons into planning reduced vehicle immobilization rates by 50% and enhanced morale, as soldiers understood that survival depended on system design rather than improvisation alone. Simulated casualty reports from 1961 exercises showed a 35% reduction in frostbite and cold weather injuries, correlating directly with improved resupply intervals. Officers concluded that human endurance must be supported by logistical fidelity, or else courage is rendered insufficient and vulnerable. NATO's investment in Cold War infrastructure along former Bulge routes, including fuel depots, reinforced bridges, and communication nodes, embodied the principle that preparation eclipsed daring. By the close of analysis, the Ardennes experience shaped Western military thought fundamentally. Peiper's frozen spearhead became a study in systemic failure, while NATO mechanized deterrence demonstrated that operational success relies on supply fidelity, ethical foresight, and realistic environmental appraisal. Comparative doctrine highlights that Blitzkrieg's audacity was untenable without supporting infrastructure, whereas post-war exercises codified redundancy and resilience as decisive. Lessons codified in NATO manuals, training simulations, and engineering reconstructions reaffirm that speed, firepower, and morale are ineffective if divorced from the reality of terrain, weather, and logistics. La Gleize's frozen frontier serves as a living archive, bridging historical catastrophe with measured forward-looking military strategy, reminding planners that history's harshest lessons demand both remembrance and adaptation. Winter morning, 23rd of January, 2024, La Gleize, Belgium. A drone sweeps over the ridgeline where Tiger II -213 once clawed through frozen mud, its 88mm cannon facing the valley below. The village of La Gleize, home to approximately 300 residents, sits quietly beneath a thin layer of frost, church steeples piercing the muted sunlight. Field markers and memorial plaques dot former tank paths, each engraved with unit designations, casualty numbers, and coordinates recorded in wartime reports. Shadows stretch across stone foundations where basements once sheltered civilians, the same spaces now housing artifacts preserved in Meuse, December 44. A cold wind brushes the remnants of cobbled streets, whispering over melted tracks once torn by panzer treads. Silence dominates, punctuated only by distant church bells that toll the quarter hour across the valley. The past feels tangible here, held in the very slope of the ridge, and in the hush between each village house. Walking along the ridge, remnants of a Tiger II suspension system, excavated in 1995, noting torsion bar deflection of up to 10 centimeters from battlefield damage. The museum curator points to melted track plates, measuring 70 centimeters wide, explaining that the metallurgical composition, 80% manganese steel, warped under the heat of incendiary artillery. These technical details reveal the logistical strain of operating 70-ton vehicles across uneven Ardennes terrain, where fuel consumption reached 350 litres per 100 kilometres, and operational range on snowbound roads shrank to barely 70 kilometres. Comparative diagrams juxtapose this with American M4 Sherman platoons, whose 30-ton weight and 200-kilometer operational range allowed them to maneuver with fewer mechanical failures, despite thinner armor of 50 millimeters at 1 kilometer. Every specification underscores the human cost of mechanical ambition and the operational limits that dictated the battlefield's rhythm. The ridge itself embodies a comparison between occupation and liberation, machinery and humanity. German forces relied on concentrated armor thrusts, assuming continuous fuel and maintenance, while American units practiced incremental advances, integrating reconnaissance and engineering units to repair bridges and roads. Local diaries, catalogued in the Meuse, December 44 archives, recount families hiding in cold basements for up to 14 hours during bombardment, noting the terror of observing distant artillery flashes without understanding which side was advancing. These civilian accounts highlight the human consequences absent from operational statistics, illustrating that the pace of technology cannot substitute for situational awareness or ethical consideration. The juxtaposition reinforces the modern principle that battlefield efficiency and human preservation must coexist, a lesson Peiper's frozen Spearhead tragically failed to teach. Field evidence confirms these lessons. A survey conducted in 2019 measured soil compaction along former Tiger II tracks, revealing depressions averaging 30 centimeters deep and trench widths of 2 meters. Belgian engineers reconstructed the terrain in virtual simulations, demonstrating that Panther and Tiger II vehicles created choke points that slowed column movement by up to 20% under winter conditions. Museum curators display SS helmets alongside American men, one steel helmets recovered from the same sites, emphasizing artifact preservation over national allegiance. The physical record mirrors archival research, confirming that mechanical failure, weather, and geography combined to dictate operational outcomes. These findings serve as tactile reminders that landscape itself shapes history, regardless of ideology or intent. The broader implication is a meditation on memory and reconciliation. Restoration of La Gleize's church, completed in 2012, alongside the Meuse December 44, reflects a commitment to preserving both German and Allied artifacts equally, fostering dialogue rather than erasure. Annual memorial services see participation from former US and German veterans, sometimes numbering over 300 attendees, bridging decades of estrangement. Visitors can read diaries describing 3-meter-deep foxholes dug by soldiers in sub-zero conditions and compare them to wartime photographs of the 88mm gun turret of Tiger II-213 frozen in situ. These acts of preservation demonstrate that honoring memory requires neither glorification nor simplification. Additional evidence from oral histories illuminates personal stakes. Interviews with local families, recorded in 2016, reveal that children hid under beds during shelling, some for hours at a stretch, while neighbors organized supply caches of bread, blankets, and candles to survive extended artillery barrages. Comparisons between civilian improvisation and military logistics show that effective organization at any scale can mitigate catastrophe, whether through battlefield engineering or community solidarity. Field markers indicate where these acts of survival intersected with armored maneuvers, linking human initiative directly to operational constraints. Preservation of these stories alongside mechanized remnants creates a layered understanding of the Ardennes experience. Operational consequences extend into contemporary understanding of conflict and education. By examining Tiger II movement corridors, artillery impact zones, and civilian shelter locations, historians reconstruct both tactical successes and failures, providing empirical data for military ethics and logistics courses. Students learn that terrain analysis, fuel consumption metrics, and weather impact are inseparable from human experience, translating historical study into practical foresight. For La Gleize, this means the village itself serves as an open-air classroom, teaching lessons of preparation, resilience, and reconciliation simultaneously. Knowledge of these metrics ensures that memory informs future action, not just commemoration. Field markers, memorial plaques, and restored architecture embody the tension between remembrance and erasure, showing that landscapes themselves can carry the weight of history without speech. Preservation of both German and Allied artifacts, coupled with lived accounts of approximately 300 residents, illustrates that memory is not solely nationalistic, but communal. The ridge demonstrates that the echoes of conflict persist in terrain, human narrative, and institutional preservation, emphasizing that while time erodes structures and snow melts from the ground, the lessons embedded in these spaces endure. La Gleize stands as testimony to the possibility of reconciliation, education, and reflection, preparing the narrative for the final philosophical synthesis in the concluding chapter. Early afternoon, 10th of February, 2024. Meuse, December 44. La Gleize, Belgium. Sunlight filters through high windows, illuminating rusted helmets, prayer books, and dog tags meticulously displayed in glass cases, each item catalogued with accession numbers from 1989 onward. Visitor logs indicate that in the previous calendar year, over 25,000 individuals from 22 countries traversed the museum halls, tracing the final route of Tiger II-213 and Peiper's beleaguered Kampfgruppe. Archival photographs, juxtaposed with modern high-definition drone footage, show frozen mud tracks, now overgrown with moss, reinforcing the weight of history pressed into every square meter. The curator gestures toward a 30-centimeter wide Tiger II track section, recovered in 1996, emphasizing torsion bar deformation that exceeded 10 centimeters during Ardennes operations. Outside, snowdrifts linger in shaded hollows, mirroring the stillness within, while faint echoes of distant church bells punctuate the quiet. Every artifact and observation underscores the tangible cost of mechanized warfare on both machines and men. Attention turns to technical specifications and battlefield analysis. The Tiger II, weighing 70 tons with a length of 10 meters, including the gun, had an 88mm KC-43 L71 cannon, capable of penetrating 200mm of armor at 1 kilometer. Yet its operational range on snow-covered Ardennes roads fell to barely 70 kilometers, consuming 350 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. Comparative studies in Aberdeen Proving Ground during 1946 tested M26 Pershing tanks, revealing a lighter 35-ton design, achieving 220 kilometers per full fuel load under similar conditions. The curatorial notes, referencing the U.S. Army Ballistics Research Laboratory report 7248, detail how the imbalance between firepower and mobility dictated the ultimate trajectory of Peiper's Spearhead. These data illuminate why technological superiority alone cannot compensate for terrain, weather, or logistical shortfalls. The narrative juxtaposes German ambition with Allied resilience. While panzer columns required concentrated fuel and engineering support every 48 hours, US and Belgian infantry units could operate in dispersed formations, relying on a supply-to-combat ratio of 1:10, compared to the German 1:7, demonstrating greater endurance under attritional conditions. Diaries from Corporal James H. Morrison, 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry Division, recount 24-hour marches over frozen ridges with minimal rations, contrasting Peiper's desperate fuel convoys stalled by artillery and snowdrifts. The comparison underscores a fundamental operational principle: momentum is futile without sustainable logistics, and the human cost of miscalculations resonates decades later. Preservation of both German and Allied artifacts in Meuse, December 44, allows visitors to grasp this duality in tangible form. Field evidence from La Gleize reinforces analytical conclusions. Survey teams measuring soil compaction along Tiger II tracks discovered depressions averaging 30 centimeters deep, with mud displaced over 2 meters laterally, indicating ground stress exceeding mechanical tolerances. Archaeological excavation of basements and foxholes revealed melted shell fragments, German SS helmets, and US M1 steel helmets, all catalogued with GPS coordinates for historical mapping. Virtual reconstruction using these data demonstrated that armor bottlenecks combined with terrain and winter conditions slowed Peiper's advance by up to 20% compared with planned schedules. These empirical findings confirm that the ridge itself dictated outcomes as much as human intent, emphasizing the inseparable link between geography and strategy. Broader implications emerge when La Gleize is interpreted as a site of reflection rather than solely conflict. UNESCO preservation initiatives, launched in 2011, established guidelines for battlefield conservation across Europe, combining structural stabilization, artifact curation, and educational outreach. Annual visitor counts now exceed 30,000, highlighting global interest in understanding both tactical failure and human endurance. The ridge operates as both scar and classroom, illustrating the paradox of war, heroic endeavor intertwined with tragic cost. Archival sources, including Peiper's operational diary and Morrison's letters, reinforce the lesson that mechanical and human systems must coexist thoughtfully to avoid catastrophic outcomes. Additional evidence underscores reconciliation and philosophical resonance. Cross-referenced visitor surveys indicate that 70% of participants engage with exhibits representing both Allied and German perspectives, reflecting a conscious choice to preserve memory without glorification. Interviews with museum educators reveal that students focus on the juxtaposition of 70-ton Tiger II mobility limitations against infantry ingenuity, exploring how strategic ambition met human adaptability. Audio installations merge faint recordings of German and American anthems, creating a subtle auditory metaphor for conflict and coexistence. These curatorial decisions encourage visitors to internalize lessons of ethical warfare alongside mechanical analysis. Operational and human consequences remain deeply intertwined. By understanding logistical constraints, mechanical failures, and environmental impediments documented on La Gleize, contemporary military planners and historians can derive principles of strategy, ethics, and preservation. Soldiers' experiences of sub-zero marches, civilians' 12-hour basement confinements, and Peiper's immobilized armored spearhead demonstrate the enduring relevance of terrain, supply, and conscience. Each artifact and field measurement becomes a conduit for empathy, connecting present observers to the psychological and physical toll borne by those who endured the battle. The ridge itself embodies history as an active participant, shaping both memory and interpretation. Global visitation statistics, UNESCO documentation, and archival citations confirm that La Gleize has transcended its wartime moment to become a site of reflection, education, and reconciliation. The final crossfade between archival and modern footage underscores temporal continuity, while faintly merging Allied and German anthems evoke the collision and coexistence of histories. The concluding voiceover intones, "Steel rusts but memory endures," as snow falls gently across the ridge. La Gleize reminds us that every victory, failure, and moral choice leaves traces in terrain, artifacts, and consciousness. The narrative concludes not with triumph or defeat, but with enduring reflection. The ridge remembers what men forget.